Hey guys, tonight we step through a creaking nursery door into an era when loving your child meant preparing them for a harsh world, through methods that would land modern parents in handcuffs. You're about to discover that the Victorians, those top-hatted, tea-sipping architects of the Industrial Revolution, had some truly remarkable ideas about raising children. And by remarkable, I mean the kind of remarkable that makes child protective services materialise out of thin air. Picture gaslit hallways, starched pinafores, and the faint scent of carbolic soap mingling with something darker. The philosophy that children were born wicked and required the wickedness beaten, starved, and terrified out of them. You probably wouldn't survive a Victorian childhood, statistically speaking. Nearly half of all children didn't make it to their 5th birthday, and the ones who did often carried scars, physical and psychological, that we'd recognise today as evidence of systematic abuse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, from someone winding down in Tokyo to another listener just starting their evening in Toronto. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the entrance hall of a respectable middle-class Victorian home, somewhere in the suburbs of London, in the year 1853. The grandfather clock ticks with that particular weighted authority that Victorian timepieces possessed, each swing of the pendulum measuring out the rigid schedule that governs every aspect of life within these walls. Gas lamps hiss softly along the corridor, casting pools of amber light that leave the corners in shadow. There's a smell here, beeswax polish, coal smoke drifting from distant fireplaces, and something astringent that might be the remnants of this morning's cleaning. You're expected upstairs, in the nursery wing, where the children of the house exist in their own carefully segregated world. As you climb the narrow servants' staircase, because visitors to the nursery don't use the main stairs naturally, you begin to understand something fundamental about Victorian childhood. Children in this era occupy a strange categorical space. They are precious certainly in the abstract sense that the future of the family line depends upon their survival. But they are also viewed as incomplete humans, morally unformed creatures whose natural inclinations tend towards sin, laziness, and selfishness. The prevailing wisdom, shared by everyone from Anglican ministers to medical doctors to your average paterfamilias reading his newspaper after dinner, holds that a child's will must be broken early and thoroughly. An unbroken will leads to moral ruin. A child who is indulged, who is allowed to cry without consequence or demand food, when hungry, or express preferences about anything at all, will grow into a weak, self-centred adult incapable of the discipline required to maintain the British Empire. You reach the nursery landing and pause. Behind that painted door, children are being raised according to principles that you, as a modern person, will find genuinely disturbing. But here's the thing that makes this era so fascinating and so troubling. The Victorians weren't monsters. They didn't wake up each morning plotting ways to traumatise their offspring. They believed, with complete sincerity, that they were doing right by their children. They were preparing them for a world that was genuinely harsh, where emotional resilience and physical endurance could mean the difference between success and destitution. The cruelty, such as it was, came packaged in love, or at least in duty, which the Victorians often conflated with love. Historians still argue whether Victorian parents were genuinely emotionally detached from their children, or whether they simply expressed affection in ways that don't translate well across the centuries. Some scholars point to private letters and diaries filled with genuine parental warmth, with anxiety over sick children and grief over lost ones. Others note that these same loving parents administered beatings, enforced starvation as punishment, and sent 7-year-olds away to boarding schools without apparent hesitation. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the complicated middle, where love and brutality coexisted in ways that made perfect sense to the people living through them. You push open the nursery door, the The room is larger than you expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the grey London light. But the windows are set high in the wall, too high for small children to see out of easily, and covered with heavy drapes that are currently half drawn. The walls are painted a practical dark green on the lower half, the better to hide the inevitable marks and scuffs of childhood, with a lighter shade above. There's a fireplace with a substantial guard around it, not for safety in the modern sense, but to prevent children from getting too close to the warmth. Comfort, after all, breeds softness. In the corner stands a rocking horse with worn paint, and against one wall sits a shelf of improving books, moral tales designed to frighten children into good behaviour, rather than to entertain them. You notice immediately what's missing. Toys, or at least toys as you understand them. There are no bright colours, no soft plush animals, nothing designed purely for joy. Play in the Victorian nursery serves educational or moral purposes, frivolous amusement is suspect. But what draws your attention most is the crib near the window. Inside, wrapped so tightly in bands of linen that you can barely see the infant beneath, lies a baby perhaps 2 months old. The child isn't crying, can't really cry effectively, you realise, because the bindings restrict even the expansion of the tiny chest. This is swaddling as the Victorians practiced it, and it bears little resemblance to the loose, hip-healthy swaddling blankets you might see in a modern nursery. This baby has been wrapped like a small mummy, arms pinned to sides, legs bound together, for hours at a stretch, perhaps for most of the day. A nursemaid notices your presence and curtsies. She's young, perhaps 16, wearing a plain grey dress with a white apron and cap. She'll spend more time with these children than their mother ever will. She'll feed them, dress them, discipline them, put them to bed, and comfort them when they wake from nightmares. If comforting is permitted, which it often isn't, because responding to a crying child teaches the child that crying produces results. The nursemaid exists in a strange liminal space, intimate enough with the children to know their fears and favourites, yet socially distant enough to be dismissed without reference. You ask about the swaddling, and the nursemaid looks at you as though you've asked why water is wet. Babies must be swaddled tightly, she explains, because their limbs are not yet properly formed. Without binding, the arms and legs might grow crooked. Worse, an unswaddled baby might touch itself inappropriately, developing shameful habits before it can even speak. And beyond the physical considerations, there's the matter of the child's emerging will. Even an infant has desires, to move, to reach, to grab, and those desires must be thwarted early. The bindings teach the very first lesson of Victorian childhood. Your body does not belong to you. This practice, you should know, wasn't universal even in its time. Medical opinion was beginning to shift by mid-century, with some progressive doctors arguing that tight swaddling weakened the limbs rather than strengthening them. But change came slowly to the nursery, where tradition and the advice of grandmothers often outweighed the latest medical journals. Working-class mothers, who needed their babies quiet while they worked, sometimes swaddled even more tightly than their middle-class counterparts. At the other end of the spectrum, a few radical parents were already experimenting with letting babies move freely, an experiment widely regarded as dangerously permissive and likely to produce ungovernable children. Here's a quirky detail that might keep you awake if you weren't already trying to sleep. Some Victorian nurseries employed devices called backboards, flat wooden boards strapped to a child's back to enforce perfect posture. These weren't reserved for children with spinal problems. Perfectly healthy toddlers spent hours each day strapped to these boards, sometimes while also wearing iron collars to keep their heads upright. The goal was to prevent slouching, which was associated with moral laxity. A child who slouched was a child whose character was literally bending towards sin. The physical and psychological effects of spending one's formative years in these contraptions were considerable, but they wouldn't be studied or understood for another century. You look at the swaddled infant again, at the nursemaid patiently straightening already straight sheets, at the improving books on the shelf with titles like The History of the Fairchild Family, where children who disobey their parents meet gruesome ends. You're standing in a room that represents the very best intentions of its era, a space designed to produce moral, upright, successful adults. The fact that it would be shut down by authorities within hours if it existed today tells you something about how dramatically our understanding of childhood has changed, and about how much we still don't agree on when it comes to raising children. But we're only beginning. The swaddled infant is just your introduction to Victorian childhood. Soon you'll meet the wet nurses, the laudanum bottles, the canes and birches, the factories and chimneys. You'll descend into workhouses and climb into boarding school dormitories. You'll attend funerals for children who never had a chance, and meet the reformers who slowly, agonizingly, began to argue that maybe children deserve protection. The nursemaid asks if you'd like to see the older children at their lessons. You nod and follow her deeper into the nursery wing, leaving the bound infant to its silent contemplation of the ceiling, learning already that desire leads nowhere, that stillness is the only option, that the world into which it has been born has very specific ideas about what kind of person it should become. The nursemaid leads you down a corridor where the floorboards have been worn smooth by generations of small feet and the heavier tread of servants carrying coal scuttles, chamber pots, and trays of nursery food. You're thinking about that swaddled infant, about the strips of linen wound so tight that the tiny fingers couldn't even flex, and you realise you need to understand this practice more deeply. Swaddling wasn't an aberration or a peculiarity of one household. It was standard infant care, practiced across Europe for centuries and reaching its elaborate peak in the Victorian nursery. You pause at a window and look out over the small garden behind the house, where later this afternoon the older children might be permitted to take air for precisely 30 minutes, weather permitting. But your mind remains in that nursery room with the immobilised infant. To understand why Victorian parents bound their babies so ruthlessly, you need to understand what they believed about the infant body, and, perhaps more importantly, about the infant soul. The medical theory went something like this. Newborn babies were essentially unfinished. Their bones were soft, their limbs were malleable, and without external support, these pliable little bodies might harden into crooked shapes. Tight swaddling, physicians argued, provided the skeletal structure that nature had neglected to include. If you wrapped a baby's legs straight, they would grow straight. If you bound the arms close to the body, the shoulders would set properly. There was something almost sculptural about the philosophy. The infant as raw clay requiring firm human hands to shape it into correct form. But the physical justifications, dubious as they were, pale beside the moral ones. You have to remember that Victorian Christianity, particularly the evangelical strain that dominated middle-class English life, took the doctrine of original sin very seriously. Every baby born into the world arrived already tainted, already inclined toward evil. The infant's will, that fundamental drive to satisfy its own desires, to cry when uncomfortable, to demand feeding when hungry, was not innocent. It was the first stirring of selfishness, the original corruption asserting itself, and selfishness, left unchecked, led to damnation. So when that infant in the crib strained against its bindings, when it tried to move its arms or kick its legs, it was expressing its sinful will. And the tight swaddling that prevented such movement was, in a very real sense, the first moral lesson. You cannot have what you want. Your desires do not matter. Submit. The baby couldn't understand these lessons consciously, of course, but Victorian parents believed that habit established early would shape character permanently. A child accustomed from birth to thwarted desires would grow into an adult capable of self-denial, of delayed gratification, of the kind of iron discipline that built empires. Here's where it gets particularly uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. The fear of infant masturbation haunted Victorian nurseries like a spectre. Medical authorities warned that babies left with free hands would inevitably discover their genitals and begin habits of self-abuse that would drain their vital energies, corrupt their moral development, and possibly lead to madness, blindness, or early death. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was mainstream medical consensus. So swaddling served as prophylaxis against sexual sin. Those bound hands couldn't reach anywhere they shouldn't. The infant body was secured against its own potential corruption. You learn from the nursemaid, who has paused to adjust a wall hanging that has gone slightly askew, that babies in this household are typically swaddled for the first 4 to 6 months of life. The bindings are loosened periodically for cleaning, a process that happens less frequently than you might hope, given Victorian attitudes toward bathing, and then immediately reapplied. Some households kept their infants swaddled even longer, especially if the child seemed particularly willful, which is to say, particularly inclined to cry or squirm. The physical consequences of this practice were considerable, though they wouldn't be properly documented until much later. Restricted movement meant restricted muscle development. Babies kept in tight swaddling often achieved motor milestones later than their unbound counterparts. More seriously, the pressure on developing hips could contribute to dysplasia, a malformation of the hip joint that might cause pain and mobility problems throughout life. The tight chest bindings sometimes interfered with breathing, and there were cases, rarely acknowledged in print, of infants who simply stopped breathing under their wrappings. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rate of the Victorian era was made worse by swaddling practices or whether other factors, disease, malnutrition, the general harshness of life, simply overwhelmed any contribution from nursery care. What we can say is that the Victorian approach to infant bodies treated them as problems to be solved rather than beings to be nurtured. The baby was dangerous to itself and needed protection from its own impulses. This philosophy would extend well beyond swaddling, shaping every aspect of how children were raised. You ask the nursemaid about her own childhood, and she looks momentarily confused, as though the question has never occurred to her. She's the daughter of a farm labourer from Kent, she tells you eventually. She was sent into service at 12. Her memories of infancy are non-existent, and her memories of early childhood are mostly of work, minding younger siblings, helping her mother with washing, learning to be useful. She was swaddled as an infant, she assumes, because everyone was. The question of whether this was good or bad simply doesn't compute. It was what was done. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of historical parenting practices, their invisibility to the people who practiced them. The nursemaid doesn't see herself as participating in a system that would horrify future generations. She's doing her job competently, following the instructions of her employers, drawing on the accumulated wisdom of centuries. She's kind to the children in her way. She knows their favourite foods, remembers their fears, speaks to them gently when no one is watching. But she also binds the infant tightly each morning without a flicker of doubt, because that's simply what one does with infants. The swaddling board, which you haven't yet seen but will encounter soon, takes this philosophy even further. Not content with mere strips of cloth, some nurseries employed flat wooden boards to which babies were actually strapped. The child lay on the board like a patient on an operating table, limbs extended and secured, sometimes for hours at a time. The boards were believed to ensure even straighter limbs, even better posture, even more thorough suppression of the dangerous will. They were also, not incidentally, extremely convenient for busy nursemaids who had multiple children to care for and limited patience for squirming infants. A quirky detail, some swaddling boards included small troughs or channels carved into the wood to direct urine away from the bound infant. This was considered an advanced feature, a mark of quality craftsmanship. The fact that infants were left strapped to these boards long enough that urinary drainage became a design consideration tells you something about the duration of their confinement. The boards were sometimes hung from hooks on the wall, keeping the immobilized infant out of the way while servants went about their other duties. A baby suspended on the wall like a family portrait, silent and still, was a baby that didn't interrupt the household routine. Not everyone approved, even then. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing in the previous century, had argued passionately against swaddling, claiming that it weakened rather than strengthened children and violated nature's intentions. His ideas influenced some progressive parents, particularly among the educated classes who had actually read Emile and found its arguments compelling. But Rousseau was French and suspiciously radical, and his child-rearing theories existed alongside the rather inconvenient fact that he had abandoned all 5 of his own children to foundling homes. Victorian parents who rejected his advice on swaddling could point to his personal life as evidence that permissive parenting led to moral bankruptcy. Medical opinion began to shift more decisively around mid-century. Physicians who studied infant development observed that freely moving babies seemed to develop more quickly than their bound counterparts. Some noted the hip problems and muscle weakness associated with prolonged swaddling. A few brave souls even suggested that allowing infants to move might be psychologically beneficial, though the vocabulary for discussing infant psychology barely existed yet. By the 1870s, tight swaddling was falling out of fashion among the fashionable, though it persisted in more traditional households and among the working classes for decades longer. You look out the window again and see that clouds are gathering over London, the eternal grey pressing down on the city. Somewhere out there, in thousands of nurseries across the metropolis, infants are lying bound and silent, learning their first lessons about the world. They're learning that their bodies are not their own. They're learning that movement is forbidden. They're learning that desire leads only to frustration, that the safest course is stillness and submission. And yet they survived. Many of them. They grew into adults who ran businesses and governed colonies, and wrote novels and invented technologies. The damage was real, but not necessarily fatal. Human beings are remarkably resilient, capable of thriving despite childhoods that would break anyone's heart to witness. This doesn't excuse the practices, but it does complicate the narrative. Victorian children weren't all ruined by their upbringing. Some emerged creative and kind, despite everything. Others became exactly the rigid, authoritarian adults their parents had worked so hard to produce. Most fell somewhere in between, carrying their early experiences like invisible luggage into futures their tightly bound infant selves could never have imagined. The nursemaid clears her throat. The older children are waiting, she reminds you. There's much more to see. You follow the nursemaid past a closed door from which you can hear the rhythmic chanting of multiplication tables, the older children at their morning lessons, and into a smaller sitting room where a young woman you haven't seen before is nursing an infant. She looks up at your entrance with an expression that's part exhaustion, part wariness. This is not the lady of the house. This is the wet nurse, and her presence in this household tells you everything about Victorian attitudes toward maternal bonding, class, and the commodification of the female body. The wet nurse, her name you gather is Sarah, is perhaps 20 years old. She comes from somewhere in the East End, her accent thicker than the nursemaid's, her clothes plainer though clean. 6 weeks ago she gave birth to her own child, a boy, who is not present in this comfortable suburban nursery. He's somewhere else, being fed by bottle or by another woman, or perhaps not being fed adequately at all. Sarah's milk, her body's response to her own infant's birth, has been redirected to nourish the children of her social superiors. In exchange, she receives wages, room and board, and the knowledge that her own baby is managing somehow without her. This arrangement would strike a modern person as bizarre at best, monstrous at worst. But in Victorian England, it was simply how things were done among families with the means to afford it. Breastfeeding was acknowledged as important for infant health, but it was also considered somewhat vulgar, animalistic, and beneath the dignity of a true lady. A woman of quality should not be reduced to the status of a milk-producing mammal. Her body existed for her husband's pleasure, and for the production of heirs, not for the messy, exhausting, time-consuming work of actually feeding those heirs. So families hired wet nurses. The practice dated back centuries. Queens and aristocrats had always employed other women to breastfeed their children, but it reached new levels of systematization in the Victorian period. Agencies existed to match wet nurses with families. Medical examinations supposedly ensured that the nurse was healthy and her milk was of good quality. References were checked, wages were negotiated, and then a young woman, still bleeding from her own recent childbirth, was installed in a stranger's nursery to become the primary source of nourishment for a baby she had no biological connection to whatsoever. The logic from the employer's perspective was impeccable. A wet nurse allowed the mother to recover more quickly from childbirth. It freed her to resume her social obligations, to accompany her husband to dinners and events, to run her household without the interruption of feeding schedules. It meant she could become pregnant again sooner, since breastfeeding tends to suppress fertility. For a woman whose primary duty was to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, the ability to cycle quickly through pregnancies was a practical advantage. But there were other considerations, ones that were rarely spoken aloud but understood by everyone. Breastfeeding created a bond between mother and child that some found uncomfortable. A woman who nursed her own baby might become too attached, too soft, too focused on the nursery, when she should be focused on managing servants and entertaining guests. The wet nurse arrangement maintained a certain emotional distance between mother and child, a distance that Victorians considered healthy and appropriate. Excessive maternal love was dangerous after all. It might lead to spoiling. Historians still argue whether this emotional detachment was genuine or performed. Some mothers, we know from their private writings, felt genuinely relieved to hand their newborns to wet nurses, freed from a burden they had never wanted. Others grieved desperately, visiting the nursery as often as they were permitted, counting the hours until they could hold their children again. And some simply accepted the arrangement without much reflection, because it was what their mothers had done and their grandmothers before that, and questioning it would be like questioning the rotation of the earth. Sarah shifts the baby to her other breast with practiced ease. You notice that her eyes are red-rimmed, whether from exhaustion or weeping you can't tell. You want to ask about her own child, the one she left behind to take this position, but the question feels impossibly intrusive. The wet nursing economy ran on separation. Separation of mother from child, of milk from the body that produced it, of human nourishment from human relationship. To acknowledge the suffering this caused would be to acknowledge that the whole system was built on a foundation of loss. Here's a detail that might haunt you. Wet nurses were typically required to wean their own babies before taking a position, or at least to hand them off to someone else to feed. An agency advertising a wet nurse would note that her own child had been disposed of, using exactly that language. Disposed of might mean the child had died. Infant mortality was so high that this was hardly remarkable, or it might mean the child had been sent to a baby farmer, a practice we'll discuss later that was often indistinguishable from murder. Either way, the wet nurse's own maternity was an inconvenience to be managed, not a relationship to be honoured. The babies who received wet nurse care were often healthier than those fed by bottle, since artificial infant formula didn't exist yet, and the alternatives, cow's milk, goat's milk, various gruesome concoctions involving bread soaked in water, were nutritionally inadequate and often contaminated. So there was a genuine health benefit to the arrangement, at least for the children of the wealthy. But this benefit came at a cost that was never tallied in the household accounts. The wet nurse's own children, deprived of their mother's milk and often their mother's presence, died at horrifying rates. You watch Sarah feeding the infant and try to imagine what she's feeling. Is she thinking about her own baby? Has she learned to suppress that thought, to focus on the child at her breast as though it were her own? Or is each feeding a reminder of what she's lost, a small death repeated every few hours? The Victorians didn't ask these questions, at least not publicly. The wet nurse was a servant, and servants' feelings were not a matter of concern. She was paid to produce milk and deliver it efficiently into the mouths of her employer's children. What happened in her heart was her own business. The lady of the house appears briefly in the doorway. She's elegant, perhaps 30, dressed in morning clothes that probably cost more than Sarah earns in a year. She glances at the nursing scene with an expression of mild approval. Everything seems to be in order, and then withdraws without speaking to either Sarah or the baby. This might be the only time today that she sees her child. There will be a formal visit to the nursery later, perhaps, a carefully scheduled half hour during which she might hold the baby and make approving noises about its growth. But the daily intimacy, the feeding and changing and comforting, belongs entirely to the servants. Modern attachment theory, developed in the mid-20th century by researchers like John Bowlby, would identify this arrangement as potentially catastrophic for infant development. Babies need consistent caregivers. They need to form secure attachments. Separation from primary attachment figures causes measurable stress, visible in elevated cortisol levels and disrupted brain development. A baby passed from wet nurse to nursemaid to occasional maternal visitor might never form the secure attachments that underpin healthy emotional development. But we should be careful about projecting our understanding backward too confidently. Victorian children weren't all psychological wrecks, despite their fragmented early care. Many grew into functional adults capable of love and intimacy. Some historians argue that the extended household, with its nursemaids and wet nurses and cooks and older siblings, actually provided a richer social environment than the modern nuclear family, where children might have only one or two consistent caregivers. Others point out that we can't know what we can't measure, and that the emotional costs of Victorian childhood may have manifested in ways that never made it into the historical record. Sarah finishes feeding and hands the baby to the nursemaid for burping. She pulls her dress back into order with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has done this hundreds of times. Tonight she'll sleep in a small room off the nursery, available for night feedings, separated from her own child by miles of London streets that she's not permitted to cross. In a few months, when the baby is weaned, she'll be dismissed with a reference and will have to find another position, another household, another infant, another separation. Some wet nurses went through this cycle dozens of times over the course of their reproductive years, their bodies producing milk for an endless succession of other women's children while their own went hungry. The nursemaid carries the baby away to be changed, and you're left alone with Sarah for a moment. She looks at you with something that might be curiosity or might be resentment. It's hard to tell. What would you say to her if you could speak freely? That her sacrifice matters? That the child she's feeding will grow up never knowing her name, while her own child might not grow up at all? That someday, in a future she can't imagine, people will look back at this arrangement and call it barbaric, but you're not here to change history. You're here to witness it. And what you're witnessing, in this comfortable nursery with its well-fed baby and its exhausted wet nurse, is a system that worked well for some people and devastated others, that prioritised convenience and class status over the most basic human bonds, and that was considered entirely normal by everyone involved. The nursemaid returns. There's more to see, she says. You're led to a cabinet in the corner of the nursery, a modest wooden thing with a brass latch, unremarkable except for its contents. The nursemaid opens it to reveal rows of small bottles, their glass glinting in the grey light from the window. Some are labelled with names you might recognise: Godfrey's Cordial, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Daffy's Elixir, and others bear only handwritten notes in brown ink. These are the soothing syrups, the quieting draughts, the patent medicines that promise to calm fretful infants and grant exhausted caregivers a few hours of peace. They were sold openly at every chemist shop in Britain, advertised in newspapers and ladies' magazines, recommended by doctors and grandmothers alike. They were also, nearly all of them, laced with opium. You pick up a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup and examine the label. It promises to soothe teething pain, quiet colic, and ensure restful sleep for baby and mother alike. What it doesn't mention is that its active ingredient is morphine sulfate, a potent opiate that would indeed make a baby very quiet, potentially forever. The Victorian medicine cabinet was, by modern standards, a pharmacy of horrors, but nothing in it was quite as horrifying as the casual way that opiates were administered to infants. The logic, from a Victorian perspective, was straightforward enough. Babies cry. Crying babies disrupt households, exhaust caregivers, and prevent everyone from getting the sleep they need to function. A few drops of soothing syrup, administered by spoon, or mixed into the baby's bottle, would quiet the crying almost immediately. The baby would sleep peacefully for hours, sometimes for entire days. The nursemaid could attend to her other duties. The parents could enjoy their evening without interruption. Everyone benefited, except, of course, the baby. Opiates work by suppressing the central nervous system. In adults, this produces feelings of euphoria and relaxation, followed by drowsiness. In infants, whose nervous systems are still developing and whose bodies are far less capable of metabolizing drugs, the effects are more severe. A dose that merely relaxes an adult can slow an infant's breathing to dangerous levels. The line between a baby sleeping peacefully and a baby slipping into respiratory failure is thin, and Victorian caregivers, measuring out their drops by guesswork and habit, crossed it regularly. The nursemaid explains the household's approach to soothing syrup with matter-of-fact practicality. The baby receives a small dose at bedtime, she says, and another if it wakes during the night. Larger doses are reserved for particularly difficult periods, teething for instance, or when the baby seems colicky. She's careful not to give too much, she assures you, because everyone knows that too much can make a baby sleep too deeply. But what constitutes too much is never precisely defined. It's a matter of judgment, of experience, of reading the baby's responses and adjusting accordingly. Here's a number that should stop you cold. Historians estimate that laudanum and other opiate preparations killed thousands of British infants every year during the Victorian period. Some estimates range as high as 12,000 annual deaths, though the true figure is impossible to know because infant deaths were often attributed to vague causes like convulsions or debility, rather than investigated for their actual origins. A baby who stopped breathing after a dose of soothing syrup might be recorded as having died from natural causes. The connection between the medicine and the death was rarely made, at least not officially. And even when babies didn't die outright, they suffered. Regular opiate exposure in infancy affects brain development in ways that researchers are still working to understand. Babies given daily doses of laudanum became dependent, experiencing withdrawal symptoms when the drug was withheld. They might be irritable, unable to sleep without their accustomed dose, trapped in a cycle of drugging that began in the cradle. Some historians have speculated about the psychological effects of spending one's earliest months in an opiate haze, though this is necessarily speculative. The Victorians didn't track such outcomes, and the affected children grew up into adults who had no memory of their drugged infancies. You ask why parents permitted this, why doctors recommended it, why anyone thought it was acceptable to give morphine to newborns. The nursemaid looks at you blankly. What else would one do with a crying baby? Comforting methods that we take for granted today, holding, rocking, feeding on demand, responding to the baby's cues, were considered at best impractical, and at worst actively harmful. A baby that was picked up every time it cried would learn that crying produced results. It would become spoiled, demanding, willful. The soothing syrup was a tool for enforcing the same philosophy that governed swaddling. The baby's desires must be thwarted, its will suppressed, its demands ignored. There's also a class dimension that you need to understand. Working-class mothers, who often had no choice but to work in factories or take in piecework to survive, relied on soothing syrups to keep their babies quiet during the long hours when they couldn't attend to them. A baby couldn't be brought to a cotton mill. It had to be left with a minder, often another child or an elderly relative, who had neither the time nor the resources to comfort a crying infant. The soothing syrup made it possible for working mothers to earn the wages their families needed to survive. It was, in a grim way, a labour-saving device. The pharmaceutical industry recognised this market and served it eagerly. Patent medicine manufacturers advertised their products with engravings of cherubic, peaceful babies sleeping under moonlit windows. They promised safety, efficacy, and relief. They did not mention the opium, or rather, they mentioned it as a selling point, since opiates were understood to be powerful and effective medicines. The danger was acknowledged only in the vaguest terms, with labels advising caregivers not to exceed the recommended dose, a recommendation that was frequently ignored, since the recommended dose often proved insufficient to quiet a particularly fussy baby. Here's a quirky and disturbing detail. Godfrey's cordial, one of the most popular soothing syrups, was sometimes given to babies in workhouses and baby farms not to comfort them, but to quiet them permanently. Caregivers who were paid to look after unwanted infants and who had no real interest in those infants' survival discovered that generous doses of Godfrey's would solve their problem efficiently and untraceably. The baby would simply fail to wake up one morning, a victim of apparent natural causes. We'll return to this practice later, but for now it's enough to note that the same medicine cabinet that promised relief could also deliver death. By the 1860s and 70s, some physicians were beginning to sound alarms. A few brave souls published articles documenting the deaths they attributed to soothing syrups, calling for regulation, or at least clearer labelling. Medical journals carried debates about whether opiates should be sold over the counter at all, given their potential for harm. But the patent medicine industry was powerful, and the demand from exhausted caregivers was insatiable. Real reform wouldn't come until the 20th century, with the passage of laws requiring accurate labelling and eventually restricting opiate sales entirely. Historians still argue whether Victorian parents who use soothing syrup should be judged harshly, or understood compassionately. On one hand, they were drugging their infants with powerful narcotics, accepting risks that would horrify any modern parent. On the other hand, they were working with the information available to them, trusting products that were legally sold and medically recommended. They didn't know what we know about infant brain development, about the long-term effects of early opiate exposure, about the mechanisms of respiratory depression. They were doing what everyone did, what had been done for generations, what seemed to work. The nursemaid closes the cabinet. The bottles clink gently against each other, their contents waiting for the next fussy night. In the crib, the baby sleeps peacefully, naturally for now, without chemical assistance. But tonight, if the baby wakes crying, if the nursemaid is tired and the household needs quiet, those bottles will come out again. A few drops on a spoon, a moment of resistance, then silence. The Victorian solution to the eternal problem of infant distress. You move away from the cabinet, carrying with you the knowledge that thousands of children died in their cradles, their breathing slowed to nothing by medicines that promised to help them, administered by caregivers who loved them, or at least who didn't wish them harm. It's a strange kind of tragedy, one built on good intentions and bad information, on exhaustion and expedience, on a culture that valued quiet babies above all else. The nursery wing, you're beginning to realise, is larger than it first appeared. Behind the main nursery with its crib and rocking horse lie other rooms. A night nursery where the children sleep, a day nursery where they take their meals and play, a schoolroom where the governess conducts lessons, and various closets and passages that exist primarily to keep children and their noise separated from the adult portions of the house. This architectural segregation tells you something important about Victorian family life. Children were precious, certainly, but they were also inconvenient, disruptive, and best kept at a distance. You stand in the doorway of the night nursery and observe the arrangement. 3 small beds line one wall, each with identical white coverlets and thin pillows. The room is cold. The fireplace is small, and the fire kept deliberately low, since warmth is considered enervating for children, and cold air builds character. The windows are high and barred, not against intruders from outside, but against children who might climb out or fall. A single nursemaid sleeps in this room with the children, her narrow cot pushed against the wall near the door, ready to respond to any disturbance. This is where the children of the house spend most of their time, not in the drawing room with their parents, not in the dining room where adult conversation happens, but here in the nursery wing, a world unto itself. The lady of the house might visit for an hour in the afternoon, summoning the children to her sitting room to be inspected and perhaps embraced before being returned to their proper domain. The master of the house might see his children at breakfast on Sundays, or perhaps not even then, depending on his temperament and the demands of his business. The nursery exists to ensure that parenting happens at a comfortable remove. The nursemaid who has been guiding you explains the daily schedule with the pride of someone describing a well-run military operation. The children wake at 6:30, summer and winter, regardless of whether the sun has risen. They wash with cold water, warm water being again too indulgent, and dress with the nursemaid's assistance. Breakfast in the day nursery at 7, bread and butter, perhaps some porridge, milk that has been watered to prevent richness. Lessons with the governess from 8 until noon, with a brief break for air in the garden if the weather permits. Dinner at noon, plain food, no seasonings, nothing that might overstimulate the appetites. Afternoon lessons until 4, then tea, supper at 6, then bed by 7. The children do not choose what to eat or when to play or how to spend their time. Every hour is accounted for, every activity supervised. Free play is not merely discouraged but practically unknown. Even the toys, such as they are, serve educational purposes. Building blocks teach spatial reasoning. Dolls teach girls to practice mothering. Toy soldiers teach boys to contemplate military glory. A child who invented a game, who used toys in unexpected ways, who preferred to daydream rather than build towers, would be corrected and redirected. Imagination, unguided by adults, was suspect. You ask about parental visits, and the nursemaid describes them with what might be a trace of wistfulness, or might be simple factual recitation. The mistress comes to the nursery most afternoons, staying for perhaps 30 minutes. She asks the governess about the children's progress, examines their copybooks, perhaps reads them a chapter from an improving book. The children stand or sit quietly during these visits, speaking only when addressed. Physical affection, hugging, kissing, climbing into laps, is not forbidden exactly, but is not encouraged either. The children have been taught to be composed, to present themselves well, to refrain from the kind of emotional displays that might embarrass everyone. The master visits less frequently, perhaps once a week. His time is valuable, his concerns are large, and the minutiae of childhood are beneath his attention. When he does appear, it is usually to deliver a lecture or to administer punishment for some transgression reported by the nursemaid or governess. He is, in short, the distant authority who enforces the rules that others implement. The children fear him more than they fear anyone else in the household, which is exactly as it should be. Fear of the father is a cornerstone of Victorian child-rearing philosophy. Historians still argue whether this distance was harmful, or whether it was simply a different mode of family organisation that we shouldn't judge by modern standards. Some point out that Victorian children often formed close bonds with their nursemaids and governesses, relationships that provided the warmth and consistency that their parents did not. Others argue that the knowledge of parental distance, the understanding that one's mother and father were fundamentally unavailable, fundamentally more interested in adult concerns than in their children's daily lives, must have had psychological effects, even if those effects don't show up in the historical record. Here's a detail that illuminates the strangeness of this arrangement. Children in wealthy households often didn't eat with their parents until they were nearly grown. Family dinners, as we understand them, didn't exist. The children had their own meals in the nursery, served at different times and consisting of different foods than the adult table. The first time a child might sit down to dinner with their parents could be at age 12 or 13, when they had finally learned enough table manners and conversation to be fit for adult company. Before that, they were essentially boarders in their own homes, residents of the nursery wing who occasionally ventured into the adult world for supervised visits. You wander into the day nursery, where the older children, a girl of perhaps 7 and a boy of 5, are engaged in what passes for play. The girl is carefully dressing a wooden doll, positioning its arms and smoothing its miniature dress with an expression of concentrated duty rather than joy. The boy is arranging tin soldiers in formation, following some pattern that has been shown to him rather than inventing his own. Neither child looks up at your entrance. They have been trained not to notice visitors unless directly addressed. The nursemaid introduces you, and the children rise and curtsy or bow as appropriate. They recite their names and ages with the precision of little automatons. They are clean, neat, well-mannered, and utterly joyless. This is not entirely fair. You can't know what they feel, and children are remarkably good at finding moments of genuine pleasure, even in restrictive environments. But the overall impression is of childhood as performance, as preparation, as anything but the spontaneous, messy, joyful experience that modern Western culture has come to expect. You think about what these children know of their parents. The mother is a presence who arrives smelling of perfume, wearing beautiful clothes, dispensing approval or disapproval in measured doses before disappearing back to her real life. The father is a more fearsome figure, associated primarily with punishment and lectures. Neither parent has ever bathed these children, dressed them for bed, comforted them after nightmares, or sat with them through an illness. Those intimacies belong to servants, who are themselves replaceable, who might leave with little notice and be replaced by strangers. A quirky historical note. Some Victorian households employed a nursery footman, a male servant whose job was specifically to carry messages between the nursery and the adult household, to fetch coal and supplies, and to provide a masculine presence that was considered important for young boys who otherwise spent all their time surrounded by women. The presence of this footman was meant to prevent boys from becoming too feminine, too soft, too attached to their nursemaids. Gender anxiety permeated even the staffing decisions of the nursery. The girl asks very politely if she might return to her doll. You nod, and she resumes her careful ministrations, her face betraying nothing. What is she thinking? What does she dream about in the narrow bed in the cold night nursery? Does she imagine a different kind of life? One where her mother reads to her every night and her father plays games on the floor? Or has she simply never conceived of such a life, having no frame of reference for what childhood could be? The nursemaid touches your arm. There are other parts of the household to see, she suggests. The children will be fine here, supervised and scheduled and safe within their carefully constructed world. You take one last look at them, the girl with her doll, the boy with his soldiers, and follow the nursemaid out of the nursery wing, through the green baize door that separates the servants' world from the families, and into the silence of the main house, where adults live their adult lives undisturbed by the sound of children. You descend to the ground floor of the house, passing through corridors where the air feels different, warmer somehow, and scented with furniture polish and the ghost of last night's dinner. This is the adult domain, where the master reads his newspaper in the study and the mistress receives visitors in the morning room. But even here, the subject of children is never far away, because the philosophy that governs the nursery extends its reach throughout Victorian society. And at the heart of that philosophy lies a single, terrible conviction. Children are born wicked, and that wickedness must be beaten out of them. You've entered the study, where a collection of implements hangs on a hook beside the fireplace. They look almost decorative, their leather and rattan and birch arranged neatly like sporting equipment. But these are not for sport. They are the tools of correction, the instruments through which Victorian parents administered the discipline they believed essential to their children's moral development. There's a riding crop, its leather worn smooth from use. There's a cane, perhaps 3 feet long, flexible enough to whistle through the air, and there's a bundle of birch rods, tied together with string, their tips split from previous applications. The master of the house uses these implements personally. This is not a duty he delegates to servants, though servants certainly discipline children as well. But serious punishment, punishment for lying, for disobedience, for willfulness, for any of the dozens of offences that a child might commit in the course of growing up, requires paternal authority. The father is the earthly representative of divine justice within the family, and his right to punish his children physically is not merely accepted but celebrated. A father who fails to beat his children is a father who fails his children, who condemns them to moral ruin through misguided softness. The biblical justification is recited so often that it hardly needs explanation. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. This verse from Proverbs, along with several similar passages, forms the scriptural foundation for corporal punishment. To beat a child is to love a child. To refrain from beating is to hate the child, to abandon them to their own sinful nature. Victorian parents who wielded the cane and birch weren't being cruel, at least not in their own understanding. They were performing an act of love, saving their children from eternal damnation by breaking the will that would otherwise lead them to hell. But the theology of punishment went deeper than simple biblical citation. Victorian evangelical Christianity emphasized human depravity in ways that earlier, more confident forms of Christianity had not. Every person was born corrupt, stained by original sin, inclined toward evil. And this was especially true of children, whose selfishness, anger, and willfulness were not innocent developmental stages, but manifestations of the old Adam, the sinful nature inherited from the fall. A crying baby was not merely hungry or uncomfortable. It was expressing its fallen nature, demanding that its desires be satisfied. A toddler's tantrum was not a normal part of development, but a glimpse of the wickedness that, uncorrected, would grow into adult sin. So correction had to begin early and continue relentlessly. The first act of disobedience, the first time an infant reached for something forbidden, the first time a toddler said no, required immediate response. The child's will had to be broken, and the earlier the breaking began, the more thorough and successful it would be. Evangelical parenting manuals of the period described the ideal outcome: a child whose will was so completely subordinated to parental authority that disobedience became literally unthinkable. Such a child would grow into an adult capable of subordinating their will to God's, which was the ultimate goal of all this painful work. You examine the birch rods more closely. They're fresh, you notice, recently cut, the bark still green in places. Birch rods were preferred for younger children because they stung without leaving permanent marks. The ideal punishment raised welts and bruises that would fade within a few days, reminding the child of their transgression without creating scars that might later require explanation. The cane was reserved for older children and more serious offences, its impact heavier, its marks longer lasting. Some fathers had their own techniques, their own preferred implements, their own theories about how many strokes were appropriate for which offences. Here's where modern law would intervene, swiftly and decisively. What Victorian parents called discipline, we call child abuse. The beating of children, even with instruments specifically designed for the purpose, even with the sincere belief that it served the child's spiritual welfare, is now illegal in most developed countries. It's recognised as harmful to physical and psychological development, ineffective as a behavioural intervention, and fundamentally a violation of human dignity. But in the Victorian period, these objections had not yet been formulated. The child had no rights that parents were bound to respect. You ask the housekeeper, who has appeared to escort you through the main house, about the frequency of punishment. She considers the question carefully before answering. In this household, she says, the children are well behaved and serious punishment is rarely necessary. Perhaps once a month one of the children earns a visit to the master's study for correction with the birch or cane. More frequent, smaller corrections, a slap, a pinch, a sharp word, happen daily, administered by the nursemaid or governess. The goal is not to punish after the fact, but to prevent misbehaviour through constant vigilance and immediate response. Historians still argue whether Victorian corporal punishment was more severe than what came before or after, or whether we've simply developed a vocabulary for criticising practices that were once universal. Archaeological evidence suggests that children have been beaten by their parents throughout human history, in every culture and era. What was distinctive about the Victorian approach was not the beating itself, but the elaborate ideological superstructure built around it, the religious and philosophical justifications that turned violence against children into a moral imperative. A quirky detail that reveals the depth of Victorian commitment to corporal punishment. Some households employed punishment books in which every offence and its corresponding correction were recorded in meticulous detail. The date, the nature of the transgression, the implement used, the number of strokes administered, all preserved for posterity, and also for review by the father, who could track his children's moral progress over time. These books survive in some archives, their entries forming a grim chronicle of childhood suffering. March 14th. George, telling falsehoods, 6 strokes birch. March 28th. Emily, speaking disrespectfully to governess, 4 strokes cane. The physical effects of these punishments were considerable. Children were sometimes beaten so severely that they couldn't sit down for days. Welts and bruises were common, infections from broken skin less so but not unknown. A few children died from beatings, though such deaths were usually attributed to other causes. The child was already sickly. The beating simply hastened an inevitable end. The psychological effects are harder to document but easier to imagine. The constant fear, the hypervigilance, the association of love with pain, the knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect you were also the people most likely to hurt you. But we should be careful not to overstate. Not every Victorian parent beat their children with enthusiasm. Some were gentle by the standards of their time, reserving physical punishment for extreme misbehaviour. Some felt guilty about the beatings they administered, even as they believed them necessary. Private letters occasionally reveal parents agonising over whether they had struck too hard, whether the punishment had truly fit the crime. The ideology demanded severity, but individual temperaments varied, and some children grew up with relatively little physical discipline. The housekeeper leads you out of the study, past the collection of rods and canes. In a few hours, the children upstairs will be brought down for their scheduled visit with their mother. They will be on their best behaviour, knowing that any transgression reported by the nursemaid could result in a summons to the study. This is how Victorian childhood functioned. Constant surveillance, immediate correction, the ever-present threat of pain hanging over every moment of every day. And yet the children who survived it went on to build railways and govern colonies and write poetry. They carried their scars, visible and invisible, into futures that the birch rods could not have predicted. You linger in the study for a moment longer, your attention drawn back to that collection of disciplinary implements. The birch rods, the cane, the riding crop. These are the formal tools of punishment, the instruments that fathers kept for serious corrections. But the reality of Victorian childhood discipline extended far beyond these ceremonial beatings. In the day-to-day management of children, caregivers reached for whatever was at hand: hairbrushes, wooden spoons, leather straps, the backs of hands. The entire material environment of the Victorian household could be transformed into weaponry against small bodies. The nursemaid, who has rejoined you after settling the children with their lessons, describes her own disciplinary authority with something like pride. She cannot administer formal punishment, that remains the father's prerogative, but she can and does employ minor corrections as needed throughout the day. A sharp slap to the hand that reaches for forbidden food, a pinch to the arm of a child who fidgets during prayers, a rap on the knuckles with whatever implement happens to be nearby. These small violences are so routine, so unremarkable, that she barely registers them as punishment. They're simply part of managing children, like wiping noses or buttoning coats. The household implements most commonly repurposed for punishment tell you something about Victorian domestic life. The hairbrush, with its flat wooden back, was perhaps the most universal tool. Every home had hairbrushes, and every child knew the sting of being bent over a knee and spanked with one. The wooden spoon served similarly, its presence in every kitchen making it always available for correction. Some households favoured leather items, a razor strop hanging in the bathroom, a belt snatched from a waist, whose flexible weight could raise immediate welts. The cane deserves special attention because it became so iconic, so associated with Victorian discipline, that the phrase "getting the cane" persists in British English long after the practice itself has been legally abolished. Canes were specifically manufactured for punishment, sold by educational suppliers alongside slates and chalk. They came in different lengths and thicknesses, with different degrees of flexibility, each design promising particular effectiveness. A thin, whippy cane produced a sharp, stinging pain that faded relatively quickly. A thicker cane delivered a deeper, more bruising impact that lasted longer. Schools administered cane punishment in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Headmasters kept canes in their offices, displayed prominently as reminders of their authority. Teachers could request that particularly troublesome students be sent to the headmaster for caning, a punishment typically delivered to the hands or the buttocks. The ritual was formalised. The student would present their hands, palms upward, or bend over a desk. The headmaster would administer a specified number of strokes. The student would thank the headmaster for the correction. This ceremonial quality was intentional. The punishment was meant to be memorable, humiliating, and public enough to serve as a deterrent to other students. Home caning followed similar patterns, though with more variation according to family preferences. Some fathers had their children bend over the arm of a chair or lie across a bed. Others preferred the children to remain standing, presenting their hands or buttocks as appropriate. The number of strokes varied with the offence, 3 or 4 for minor transgressions, 6 or 8 for more serious ones, a dozen or more for truly egregious misbehaviour. Some fathers added strokes for crying or flinching, teaching children to accept their punishment stoically. The birch rod, which you noticed earlier, was considered more severe than the cane despite its lighter construction. A bundle of birch twigs, freshly cut and still supple, delivered a different kind of pain, sharper, more distributed, raising hundreds of tiny welts rather than the single line of a cane stroke. Birching was often reserved for younger children, its sting being intense but short-lived, leaving marks that faded within hours. Some parents believed birching was actually kinder than caning, because it delivered equivalent pain with less lasting damage. Others simply preferred the drama of the birch, its rustic quality, its association with traditional country discipline. Here's a detail that modern parents would find particularly disturbing. Some Victorian households kept their disciplinary implements prominently displayed as constant reminders of what awaited misbehaviour. A cane leaning in the corner of the nursery, a birch bundle hanging from a hook, a hairbrush always on the mantelpiece. These visual prompts were considered beneficial, keeping children in a state of healthy fear even when no punishment was imminent. The threat of pain was as important as the pain itself, creating an atmosphere of constant vigilance that many parents believed encouraged good behaviour. Historians still argue about the relationship between corporal punishment and the broader culture of violence in Victorian society. Some suggest that a childhood saturated with physical punishment produced adults who were comfortable with violence, who could administer it without flinching and receive it without complaint. Useful qualities for maintaining an empire. Others argue that the connection is more complex, that many Victorians who were beaten as children became advocates for gentler parenting as adults, having learned first-hand how little violence actually accomplished. The medical profession, which you might expect to have raised objections, largely endorsed corporal punishment throughout the Victorian period. Physicians wrote approvingly of the salutary effect of physical discipline on children's character, recommending it as a treatment for everything from disobedience to nervous disorders. A few medical voices suggested moderation, warning that excessive beating could damage children's health, but these concerns focused on degree rather than principle. The idea that hitting children might be fundamentally wrong, that it might constitute harm rather than help, simply didn't compute within the Victorian medical worldview. You ask the nursemaid about her own childhood punishments, and she answers with the same matter-of-fact tone she's used throughout your conversation. She was beaten regularly, she says, by her parents, and later by her employers when she entered service. She remembers specific occasions, a severe caning for lying, a birching for breaking a dish, but mostly the punishments blur together into a background hum of childhood experience. She doesn't seem traumatized, at least not in any way she can articulate. The beatings were simply part of a life, like cold winters and hard work, Everyone experienced them. They built character. This acceptance, this normalization of violence against children, is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Victorian childhood for modern observers to comprehend. The nursemaid isn't suppressing trauma or performing resilience. She genuinely doesn't register her childhood beatings as remarkable. The same is true of most Victorian adults, who remembered their punishments as necessary correctives rather than abuse. This normalization allowed the practice to continue unchallenged, generation after generation, each cohort of beaten children growing into adults who beat their own children with clear consciences. A quirky footnote. Some Victorian parents subscribe to theories about the timing of punishment that strike modern ears as almost comically elaborate. One school of thought held that punishment should be administered immediately after the transgression, while the connection between offence and consequence was still clear. Another argued for delayed punishment, believing that the anticipation of inevitable pain was itself educational. Some parents punished before meals, reasoning that a full stomach might dull the pain. Others punished after meals, worried that the stress of anticipation might interfere with digestion. The fact that serious adults debated these fine points tells you how central corporal punishment was to the Victorian project of raising children. The housekeeper appears in the doorway, reminding the nursemaid that the children will need their luncheon soon. You follow them out of the study, leaving behind the birch and cane and riding crop, implements that waited in patient readiness for the next offence, the next correction, the next occasion for a father to demonstrate his love by inflicting pain. You step outside the comfortable suburban house for a moment, breathing air that tastes of coal smoke and horse dung and the particular grime of industrial London. The nursery you've been exploring belongs to a middle-class family, respectable but not wealthy, the kind of household that employed 3 or 4 servants and worried constantly about maintaining appearances. But the children you've seen so far, however strictly raised, however frequently beaten, however emotionally neglected, have been the lucky ones. Because now you need to understand what happened to children at the other end of the economic spectrum. Children for whom the discipline of the nursery would have seemed like paradise compared to the discipline of the factory, the mine, the chimney flue. You make your way toward the East End, where the streets narrow and the buildings crowd together, and the sky seems permanently dimmed by smoke from countless chimneys. Here, childhood is not a protected stage of development, but an economic resource. Children as young as 4 and 5 work alongside adults, contributing their small wages to family survival, their small bodies to industrial production. The Victorian economy runs, in no small part, on child labour. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. In 1850, approximately 1/3 of all children in England between the ages of 10 and 14 were employed in some form of paid labour. For younger children, the numbers are harder to estimate because much of their work happened informally, off the books, in family workshops and agricultural fields. But conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of children under 10 worked regularly, some of them full-time, some of them in conditions that would kill an adult. You pause outside a cotton mill, its windows glowing with gaslight despite the hour. Inside you can hear the thunder of machinery, the endless clatter of looms and spindles. Children work in these mills, you know, tiny figures darting between massive machines, cleaning lint from moving parts, retrieving broken threads, performing tasks that require small fingers and flexible bodies. The factories prefer children for these jobs not only because they're cheaper than adults, but because they're physically better suited to the work. An adult couldn't crawl beneath a running loom. A child can. The hours are staggering. In the early Victorian period, before the Factory Acts began to impose limits, children commonly worked 12, 14, or even 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. They started before dawn and finished after dark, their only light coming from gas lamps that made the air even more poisonous than it already was. They were not permitted to sit down during their shifts. They were not permitted to eat except during brief, carefully timed breaks. They worked until they collapsed, and sometimes they collapsed into machinery that was not designed to stop for anyone. The injuries are the stuff of nightmare. Children caught their hands in spinning machinery and lost fingers, arms, entire limbs. Children fell into vats of chemicals used in textile processing and emerged with burns that would never fully heal. Children who worked as scavengers, crawling beneath machines to collect loose cotton, were sometimes crushed when the machinery unexpectedly resumed operation. The small bodies that made children valuable also made them vulnerable, and Victorian factories consumed them with mechanical indifference. Here's a number that should give you pause. In some textile mills during the 1820s and 30s, the average lifespan of a child who began work at age 6 was estimated at 17 years. They worked until they died, often from respiratory diseases caused by breathing cotton dust, sometimes from accidents, occasionally from simple exhaustion. Their bodies were worn out before they reached adulthood, their growth stunted, their health destroyed, their futures measured in years rather than decades. You move past the mill and come to a neighbourhood where chimneys rise from every rooftop. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, each one requiring regular cleaning to prevent the build-up of soot that could cause a chimney fire. And here you encounter one of the most notorious forms of Victorian child labour. The climbing boys, children sold or rented to master sweeps who sent them up into narrow, hot, dark chimneys to scrape away soot with their bare hands. The climbing boys were typically very young, 5, 6, 7 years old, because older children couldn't fit into the narrowest flues. They were often orphans or children of desperately poor families who had no other option. The master sweeps who employed them were notorious for cruelty, using fire and pins to force reluctant children up the chimneys, beating those who came down too slowly or too clean. The boys worked naked or nearly so, their bodies scraping against rough brick, their lungs filling with soot, their knees and elbows developing the calluses and sores that were considered marks of experience. The health effects were devastating. Climbing boys developed a form of cancer, scrotal cancer, caused by constant exposure to soot, that was so specifically associated with their occupation that it became known as chimney sweeps cancer. They suffered chronic respiratory problems, stunted growth, and skeletal deformities from working in confined spaces during the years when their bones were still forming. Many died in the chimneys themselves, becoming stuck in narrow passages, suffocating or burning to death before they could be extracted. Historians still argue about why child labour persisted so long in the face of such obvious suffering. Some point to economic necessity. Families simply couldn't survive without their children's wages, and employers depended on cheap labour to remain competitive. Others emphasise ideology, the belief that work was morally improving, that idleness was sinful, that even young children benefited from learning the discipline of labour. Still others note the political weakness of those who might have advocated for change. The children themselves had no voice. Their parents were too poor and too politically marginal to matter, and the employers who benefited had both money and influence. A quirky detail that illuminates the moral flexibility of the era. Some factory owners and mine operators genuinely believed they were doing poor children a favour by employing them. Work kept children off the streets, taught them useful skills, and provided income that might otherwise come from begging or crime. The alternative to child labour in this view was not happy childhood but starvation. This argument had enough surface plausibility that it convinced many people who might otherwise have objected to the sight of 5-year-olds operating dangerous machinery. You look around at the streets of the East End where children are everywhere, running errands, hawking goods, minding younger siblings while their parents work. Some of them will spend tomorrow in a factory or a workshop, their small wages essential to family survival. Some will work until they're injured or sick, then be discarded when they can no longer produce. Some will die before they reach their 10th birthday, worn out by labour that their bodies were never designed to perform. This is the other face of Victorian childhood, the face that the comfortable nurseries uptown never see. The children of the middle and upper classes are beaten and neglected, certainly, but they're not worked to death. They're not sent into chimneys or under looms. The cruelties they suffer are emotional and physical, but not industrial. The line between a difficult childhood and a fatal one was drawn largely by class, and that line determined everything. The factories and chimneys you've witnessed represent the rawest form of Victorian child exploitation, but you should understand that change, when it came, arrived slowly and reluctantly. The story of factory reform is not a straightforward tale of awakening conscience, but a messy, contentious, decades-long struggle in which every modest protection for children was fought over as though the fate of civilization hung in the balance, and in a way the Victorians believed it did, just not in the way we might expect. You find yourself in the public gallery of the House of Commons, where Parliament is debating yet another attempt to limit child labour. The year is 1833, and the bill under consideration would prohibit the employment of children under 9 in textile factories, limit children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours of work per day, and require that child workers receive at least 2 hours of education daily. These proposals seem modest, almost laughably so. 8 hours of factory work for a 9-year-old would still be illegal almost everywhere in the modern world. But they're being fought with the intensity of a holy war. The opponents of reform make arguments that sound bizarre to modern ears, but were perfectly coherent within the Victorian worldview. They argue that limiting child labour would devastate families who depend on children's wages, leaving them to starve. They argue that idle children would get into trouble, their characters weakened by too much freedom. They argue that the British economy would collapse if forced to compete with foreign manufacturers who face no such restrictions. And beneath all these practical objections lies a deeper philosophical resistance, the belief that the government has no business interfering with private contracts between employers and employees, even when those employees are children, even when those contracts are negotiated by desperate parents willing to accept any terms. The reformers counter with accounts of mangled bodies, of children worked until they dropped, of morgues filled with tiny corpses whose only crime was being born poor. They invoke the testimony of doctors who have examined factory children and found them stunted, diseased, dying. They read letters from the children themselves, dictated since most cannot read or write, describing conditions that shame any nation calling itself Christian. The debate is emotional, contentious, and ultimately successful, though only partially. The Factory Act of 1833 passes, but with compromises that leave many children unprotected. Here's the frustrating truth about Victorian factory reform. It happened piecemeal, over decades, with each new protection applying only to specific industries or age groups. The 1833 Act covered only textile factories. Mines weren't regulated until 1842, after a royal commission produced a report so shocking, illustrated with images of naked children crawling through underground passages, that even the most hardened industrialists couldn't ignore it. The Chimney Sweepers Acts of 1840, 1864 and 1875 attempted to prohibit climbing boys, but enforcement was so lax that the practice continued into the 1880s. Each reform faced resistance from predictable quarters. Manufacturers warned of economic ruin. Politicians worried about government overreach. Philosophers debated whether children had rights at all, or whether they were simply the property of their parents, to be disposed of as parental judgment dictated. The idea that a child might have legal protection against exploitation, even against exploitation by their own parents, was genuinely radical, a departure from centuries of tradition in which children were economic assets to be deployed as needed. The reformers came from various backgrounds and held various motivations. Some were evangelical Christians who believed that child labour violated biblical principles of mercy and justice. Some were romantic idealists who saw in childhood a natural innocence being corrupted by industrial capitalism. Some were early socialists who viewed child labour as one symptom of a fundamentally unjust economic system. And some, it must be said, were less concerned with children's welfare than with controlling the working classes, ensuring that the poor were educated into compliance and productivity rather than left to develop their own ideas. Historians still argue about which of these motivations predominated, and whether the factory reforms should be seen as genuine humanitarianism or social control in humanitarian clothing. The truth probably involves elements of both. Victorian reformers were products of their time, carrying the prejudices and blind spots of their class, even as they worked to address suffering that their class had largely caused. The same Parliament that limited child labour also passed poor laws that punished poverty and workhouse regulations that separated families. Reform was always partial, always compromised, always shaped by the interests of the powerful. A quirky detail from the reform debates. Some opponents of child labour legislation argued that children actually preferred work to idleness, that they found factory life stimulating and social, that restricting their ability to work would make them unhappy. This argument sounds absurd now, but it was made seriously, supported by the occasional testimony of children who had been coached to say the right things. The ability of adults to convince themselves that exploitation was actually kindness has rarely been displayed more clearly. By the end of the Victorian period, roughly 1890, the situation had improved substantially, but remained far from modern standards. Education had become compulsory, which effectively limited the hours children could work by requiring them to be in school. The minimum age for employment had risen, though it varied by industry and location. Inspectors enforced regulations with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and employers found creative ways to evade restrictions they found burdensome. A child in 1890 still might work in a family business or agricultural setting from a young age, might take on paid employment at 12 or 13, might work alongside adults in conditions that posed real risks to health and safety. You leave the public gallery and step back onto the streets of London, thinking about the long, slow arc of reform. The children you see passing, some in school uniform, some in working clothes, some in the rags of the very poor, represent different stages of this incomplete revolution. Some will spend their childhoods in classrooms, others in workshops, others in the grey zone between education and labour that Victorian law created and never fully resolved. The Factory Acts didn't end child labour, they channelled it, regulated it, made it slightly less deadly. And they laid the groundwork for further reforms that would come in the 20th century, building on precedents established in these contentious Victorian debates. The lesson, perhaps, is that progress happens not in dramatic moments of transformation, but in incremental steps, each step fought for and incomplete, each step leaving more work to be done. The Victorian reformers who campaigned against child labour rarely lived to see their full vision realised. They won partial victories, suffered frequent defeats, and passed on their work to the next generation. This is how change happens in human societies. Slowly, frustratingly, one compromise at a time. You turn your attention now to a different form of child labour, one that happened not in the public spaces of factories and mines, but in the private spaces of middle-class and wealthy homes. The scullery maid scrubbing pots at 3 a.m, the boot boy blacking shoes before the family rises, the nursery assistant learning the 1,000 small tasks that keep a Victorian household running. These children were also working, often from ages as young as 7 or 8, but their labour was largely invisible, hidden behind the green baize door that separated servants' quarters from family spaces, unreported in government statistics, unprotected by factory acts that applied only to industrial settings. You follow a narrow staircase down to the basement of a substantial townhouse, where the kitchen and scullery operate around the clock to serve the needs of the family above. The heat hits you first. The enormous cast-iron range never fully cools, and the air is thick with steam from boiling pots and the grease of endless cooking. Then the smell, coal smoke, rendered fat, the particular staleness of spaces where fresh air rarely penetrates. And then you see her. A girl of perhaps 10 standing on a wooden box to reach the sink, her arms plunged elbow deep in grey water, scrubbing at a pot nearly as big as she is. This is domestic service, the largest employer of women and children in Victorian England. At any given time, millions of people worked as servants, and a substantial proportion of them were children. They came from poor families who couldn't afford to keep them, or from orphanages looking to place their charges, or from rural areas where there was no work at all. They were sent into service with the understanding that they would learn a trade, receive room and board, and perhaps save a few shillings towards some unspecified future. What they actually experienced was more complicated. The scullery maid was the lowest of the low in the servant hierarchy, beneath the cook, beneath the housemaids, beneath nearly everyone except perhaps the boot boy. She rose earliest and slept latest. She washed the dishes, scrubbed the floors, cleaned the grates, hauled coal, and performed every dirty, heavy, repetitive task that more senior servants refused. She was often cold, often hungry, often exhausted, working 18 or 20 hours a day for wages so small that they were usually described in shillings per year rather than pounds. She slept in an attic or basement room, sometimes sharing a bed with other servants, sometimes on a pallet in the kitchen itself. The children who entered domestic service were supposed to be learning, acquiring skills that would serve them as they rose through the ranks of the servant world. And some did rise, the most capable and fortunate advancing from scullery maid to kitchen maid to cook, or from boot boy to footman to butler. But many more remained in the lowest positions for years, worn down by endless labour, their health damaged by poor nutrition and inadequate sleep, their spirits broken by the constant demands of employers who expected perfection and punished anything less. Here's the thing that made domestic service particularly insidious. It happened inside families. Factory children at least worked alongside other children, might form friendships, might find moments of solidarity. Domestic servants were isolated, outnumbered by their employers, dependent on the whims of people who held total power over their daily lives. A kind employer could make service tolerable, a cruel one could make it hellish. And there were no inspectors visiting private homes, no regulations governing hours or conditions, no one to appeal to if things went wrong. The girl at the sink, let's call her Mary, though you never learn her name, pauses for a moment to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her wet hand. She's been working since 4:30 this morning, when she rose to light the fires and heat water for the family's morning ablutions. She'll work until 10 or 11 tonight, when the last of the dinner things are washed and put away. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the day after that, stretching out endlessly until she's too old or too sick to continue, and is dismissed to make room for a younger, healthier replacement. You ask the cook about Mary's background, and she answers without looking up from the pie crust she's rolling. The girl came from a charity school, she says, sent into service at 8 after her mother died, and her father remarried. She's been in this household 2 years now, learning her duties. She's slow and clumsy, but shows promise. In a few years, if she survives and proves capable, she might be promoted to kitchen maid. The cook's tone suggests that this is a kindness, an opportunity that Mary should be grateful for, and perhaps by the standards of the time it is. The alternative, the workhouse, the street, slow starvation, would be worse. Historians still argue about whether domestic service should be classified alongside factory labour as exploitation, or understood as something more complex, a form of social mobility perhaps, or an apprenticeship system that served the interests of both servants and employers. The servants themselves left relatively few records, being mostly illiterate, and those who did write memoirs later in life often sanitised their experiences. What we can say is that the experience varied enormously depending on the household, the particular employer, and sheer luck. A quirky detail that illuminates the strangeness of the arrangement. Servants, including child servants, were sometimes given new names by their employers. A family that had previously employed a housemaid named Sarah might insist that their new housemaid, whatever her actual name, also be called Sarah to avoid confusion. The servant's identity was subordinated to the household's convenience, her very name a matter for others to decide. Some servants spent their entire working lives answering to names that weren't theirs, their original identities forgotten by everyone, including themselves. The basement kitchen grows hotter as the afternoon cook-up begins. Mary returns to her scrubbing, her small hands red and raw from constant immersion in harsh water. Above her, in the comfortable rooms of the house, children of nearly her own age are being raised by nursemaids and governesses, their greatest hardship a caning from their father or a missed pudding at dinner. The gulf between these two childhoods, children in the same house separated by a single staircase, tells you everything about Victorian class relations and nothing about what Mary feels as she scrubs. She might feel resentment, trapped in labour while others play. She might feel gratitude, aware that her situation could be worse. She might feel nothing much at all, her emotional life compressed by exhaustion into a narrow band of survival. The historical record gives us no access to her inner world. We can only observe her small figure at the enormous sink, the steam rising around her, the pot gradually coming clean, and imagine. You climb back up from the basement kitchen and make your way to the dining room, where the table is being laid for the evening meal. Silver gleams, crystal catches the light from gas fixtures overhead, and everything speaks of abundance, more food than the family could possibly eat, more courses than any appetite could welcome. But you're not here to observe the adults at their dinner. You're here to understand what happened to the children, and specifically what, and how much, Victorian children were permitted to eat. Remember that swaddled infant in the nursery, the one whose every movement was restricted because desire itself was considered dangerous. That same philosophy extends to food. The Victorian approach to feeding children was shaped by the conviction that appetite, like all physical desires, must be carefully controlled. Overfeeding was believed to encourage greed, sensuality, and moral weakness. A child who was given everything it wanted to eat would grow into an adult who expected gratification on demand. The correct approach, therefore, was strategic deprivation. Enough food to sustain life and growth, but not enough to satisfy completely. The nursery meals you encountered earlier, the watered milk, the plain porridge, the unseasoned vegetables, represent this philosophy in action. Victorian children ate different food from adults, prepared separately, served at different times in different rooms. The children's diet was deliberately bland and limited, designed to nourish without pleasuring. Spices were forbidden, sugar was rationed, and anything rich or flavourful was reserved for adults whose characters were already formed and could withstand the temptation. You learn from the housekeeper, who's rejoined you for this portion of the tour, about the specific dietary rules enforced in this household. Children receive no butter on their bread. Adults receive it freely. Children drink water or milk. Adults drink wine with dinner. Children eat their vegetables boiled to mushiness with no seasoning. Adults enjoy them prepared with care and flavour. The difference is not a matter of economy. This family can afford to feed its children well, but of philosophy. The children's meals are deliberately less appealing because less appealing meals teach less desire. Here's where the system becomes truly punitive. Food could be withheld as punishment. A child who misbehaved might be sent to bed without supper. A child who displayed excessive appetite, eating too quickly, reaching for more, expressing enjoyment too enthusiastically, might have portions reduced as a corrective. The message was clear. Food was not a right but a privilege, granted by parents who could just as easily withdraw it. Some households enforced bread and water days, when children who had committed various offences were restricted to the most minimal sustenance. Their hunger intended to remind them of their transgressions. The medical theories of the era supported this approach, or at least failed to contradict it. Physicians believed that children's digestive systems were weak and easily overwhelmed. Rich food would cause indigestion, overstimulate the nervous system, and potentially lead to serious illness. Better to err on the side of caution, feeding children simple fare in modest quantities. The fact that many Victorian children showed signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, rickets, poor teeth, was attributed to various causes, but rarely to the deliberately restricted diets that prevailed in nurseries. This wasn't universal, of course. Working-class children ate what the family could afford, which was often too little rather than too bland. The children of the poor faced actual hunger, the kind that stunts development and kills, while the children of the comfortable faced engineered hunger, a manufactured scarcity designed to shape character. Both forms of deprivation left their marks, but they were fundamentally different experiences with fundamentally different meanings. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of Victorian dietary practices on children's physical development. Some point to the relatively short stature of Victorian adults compared to modern populations as evidence of widespread malnutrition. Others note that genetics, disease, and overall living conditions played larger roles than nursery feeding practices. What we can say is that the philosophy of strategic deprivation represented yet another front in the Victorian campaign to break children's wills, to teach them that their desires didn't matter, that satisfaction was not something they could expect. A quirky detail: some Victorian child-rearing manuals recommended specific foods believed to have particular character effects. Meat was considered stimulating, and was therefore limited for children whose passions needed no encouragement. Fish was believed to be brain food, and was encouraged for children studying for examinations. Cheese was thought to cause nightmares, and was avoided in evening meals. These associations had no basis in nutritional science, which barely existed as a field, but they shaped what children actually ate in ways that their descendants might find bizarre. The distinction between children's food and adult food served social as well as moral purposes. When children finally did graduate to the adult table, usually around age 12 or 13, they entered a new world of flavours and sensations that they had spent their entire childhoods being denied. This transition marked the beginning of adulthood, when appetite was finally permitted expression, and desire was no longer quite so dangerous. But by that point, the lessons had been learned. The adult who had spent childhood eating bland porridge, while adults enjoyed roast beef, had internalised the message: you get what you're given, not what you want. You watch as the dining table is completed, each place set with its array of silverware and glassware, each position marked by a card indicating who will sit where. The children will not eat here tonight. They ate hours ago, in the nursery, food that bore no resemblance to what their parents will enjoy. And tomorrow, they'll eat the same plain fare again, their appetites carefully managed, their desires systematically denied, their small bodies fed just enough to grow but not enough to thrive. The housekeeper mentions, almost as an afterthought, that the oldest child, the 7-year-old girl you saw playing with her doll, has been losing weight recently. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The doctor has been consulted. He's recommended more fresh air and perhaps a tonic. No one has suggested that she might simply need more food, better food, food that she actually wants to eat. That possibility doesn't fit within the prevailing philosophy. If she's thin, it's because of constitution or illness, not because she's been deliberately underfed since birth. You leave the dining room behind and make your way toward the morning room, where you've been told the family doctor is expected shortly for his weekly visit. Victorian medicine deserves its own examination because it shaped childhood in ways both direct and indirect, and because many of the treatments that physicians administered would be recognised today as forms of harm rather than healing. The doctor arrives in his carriage, a man of perhaps 50 with mutton chop whiskers and the confident bearing of someone whose advice is rarely questioned. He's here to examine the children, part of the regular routine that middle-class families followed to ensure their offspring were developing properly. What this examination actually involves, and what treatments might follow from it, would strike a modern parent as somewhere between ineffective and actively dangerous. Victorian medicine operated without germ theory for much of the era. The understanding that diseases were caused by microorganisms only gained wide acceptance in the 1870s and 80s. Before that, physicians relied on frameworks that dated back centuries. The theory of humours, which held that illness resulted from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Miasma theory, which attributed disease to bad air and noxious smells. And a general conviction that aggressive intervention, purging, bleeding, blistering, could restore balance to the sick body. Children received these treatments with particular intensity because their bodies were considered more malleable, more susceptible to correction. A child with a fever might be bled, either through the application of leeches or through direct incision of a vein. The theory was that fever represented an excess of blood, a plethora that needed to be released. The practice was that sick children were weakened further, their chances of recovery diminished rather than improved. Some physicians bled children for almost any ailment: coughs, digestive complaints, skin conditions, behavioural problems. The lancet and the leech jar were standard equipment. Mercury was administered so commonly that it hardly seemed remarkable. Calomel, mercurous chloride, appeared in nearly every patent medicine and many physician-prescribed treatments. It was given as a purgative, intended to clear the bowels and restore healthy function. What it actually did was poison children slowly, causing symptoms that included salivation, tooth loss, kidney damage, and neurological problems. The phrase, mad as a hatter, comes from the mercury poisoning that afflicted workers in the hat industry, but children dosed with calomel experienced similar effects on a smaller scale. Here's a detail that should make you shudder. Teething powders, those seemingly innocent preparations marketed to soothe the pain of emerging teeth, often contained both mercury and opiates. A baby cutting its first molars might be given a product that combined the sedative effects of laudanum with the toxic effects of calomel, a 1-2 punch of pharmacological harm disguised as gentle relief. Teething powder poisoning killed enough babies that it eventually became a recognised syndrome, though this recognition came slowly and manufacturers resisted reformulation for decades. The doctor examines the children with the brisk efficiency of a professional who has many calls to make. He checks their tongues, peers into their ears, palpates their abdomens, asks the nursemaid about their bowel movements with a frankness that surprises you. The bowels, in Victorian medical thinking, were the key to health. Regular evacuation was essential, and anything short of daily movements indicated dangerous constipation that must be treated aggressively. Children were dosed with purgatives on schedules, whether they needed them or not, their small intestines perpetually irritated by unnecessary medication. The 7-year-old girl, the one who's been losing weight, receives particular attention. The doctor prescribes a tonic, as predicted, something containing iron and perhaps arsenic, which was believed to build blood and strengthen constitution. He also recommends a course of blistering for her chest, a treatment involving the application of caustic substances to raise painful welts on the skin. The theory was that blistering drew illness outward, away from internal organs and toward the surface where it could escape. The practice was that a small girl would soon have raw, weeping wounds on her chest that would hurt for days and accomplish nothing. Historians still argue about how Victorian parents processed the disconnect between medical treatment and outcomes. Children who were treated often got worse. Children who died had usually been under a physician's care. Yet faith in medicine remained largely intact, supported by the same deference to authority that shaped every aspect of Victorian life. If the doctor said to bleed the child, you bled the child. If the child died anyway, it was God's will, not medical failure. A quirky and gruesome detail. Some physicians specialised in treating children's behavioural problems with medical interventions. A child who masturbated, a concern that haunted Victorian parents as much as it haunted the nursery, might be treated with blistering of the genitals, application of restrictive devices, or even surgical procedures intended to make the behaviour impossible. These treatments were considered legitimate medicine, published in respectable journals, practiced by reputable physicians. The boundary between medicine and torture was frequently crossed in the name of protecting children from their own bodies. Vaccination represents one of the genuine success stories of Victorian medicine, though even here the picture is complicated. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine had been introduced in the late 18th century and became increasingly common throughout the Victorian period. By mid-century, vaccination was compulsory in England, and smallpox deaths among children dropped dramatically. but vaccination carried its own risks in an era before standardization and sterile technique. Vaccines were sometimes contaminated, sometimes administered with unsterilized instruments, sometimes derived from infected cows that transmitted other diseases along with immunity. Some children died from vaccination itself, though far fewer than would have died from smallpox. The doctor finishes his examination and writes out his prescriptions with the rapid confidence of certainty. The nursemaid will collect the medicines from the chemist tomorrow. The tonic, the purgative, the ingredients for poultices and blisters. The children will swallow what they're given without question, as they swallow everything: the bland food, the cold baths, the beatings, the doctrines of original sin. And some of them will be harmed by treatments intended to help, weakened by bleeding, poisoned by mercury, scarred by blistering. Their small bodies the battleground for medical theories that would be recognised as harmful within a generation. The doctor departs, his carriage clattering away down the cobblestone street, and you're left thinking about something he mentioned in passing during his examination: mortality. He spoke casually, almost cheerfully, about the fact that childhood illness often proved fatal, as though death was simply another stage of development that some children passed through and others did not. This attitude, which strikes modern ears as monstrous, was actually a survival strategy for Victorian parents facing a brutal statistical reality. Their children were probably going to die. The numbers bear this out with grim precision. In 1850, approximately 1 in 4 children born in England died before reaching their first birthday. Among the poor, the figure was higher, sometimes 1 in 3 or even 1 in 2 in the most desperate slums. Another substantial percentage died between ages 1 and 5, victims of measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, and the dozens of other diseases that swept through Victorian communities with seasonal regularity. A woman who bore 6 children might reasonably expect to bury 3 of them. You find yourself in the nursery again, looking at the crib where the swaddled infant lies. This baby has approximately a 75% chance of reaching age 5. Better odds than most, given the family's relative prosperity, but still a gamble that modern parents would find unacceptable. The nursemaid knows these odds intimately, having watched other children in other households sicken and die. She performs her duties with care, but she's been advised by doctors, by clergymen, by the accumulated wisdom of generations, not to become too attached. This advice sounds callous, but had a certain protective logic. Maternal love, unchecked, could be devastating when its object died. Women who grew too attached to their infants, who nursed them personally, who spent too much time in the nursery, might be destroyed by grief when death came. The emotional distance enforced by wet nurses and nursemaids, and the spatial separation of the nursery wing served, in part, to protect parents from the full impact of loss. If you never fully bonded with your child, you wouldn't be fully broken when that child was taken from you. Here's where Victorian theology intertwined with Victorian mortality in particularly painful ways. The doctrine of infant damnation, the belief that unbaptized babies who died went to hell, was officially discredited by most mainstream denominations by the mid-19th century, but it lingered in evangelical circles and haunted parental imaginations. Even parents who didn't believe in infant damnation worried about their children's spiritual state, about whether young souls had been adequately prepared for eternity. The urgency of religious instruction, the endless catechisms and prayers, the emphasis on breaking the child's sinful will, all of this gained intensity from the knowledge that death might come at any moment, that there was no time to waste in the project of salvation. Some parents responded to child death with remarkable acceptance, interpreting it as God's will, and finding comfort in the belief that their children had been spared the trials of earthly life. These parents might speak of their dead children as little angels called home to heaven, might find solace in elaborate mourning rituals, might even express gratitude that their babies had been taken before they could sin and jeopardize their salvation. This acceptance wasn't always genuine. Private letters sometimes reveal anguish that public performances concealed, but it was culturally expected and widely performed. Other parents were devastated regardless of theological consolation. Queen Victoria herself, that exemplar of Victorian values, never fully recovered from the death of her husband Albert, but she had also lost a child, Princess Alice, and spoke of that grief throughout her remaining years. The elaborate mourning culture of the Victorian period, with its black clothing and memorial jewellery and rigid social protocols, provided structure for grief but didn't necessarily provide relief. Parents buried their children and then were expected to continue functioning, to produce more children, to maintain the social obligations that constituted respectable life. Historians still argue about whether Victorian parents loved their children less than modern parents do, or whether they simply expressed that love differently under the pressure of circumstances we can barely imagine. Some evidence suggests genuine emotional investment, letters written to dying children, diaries recording the progression of illness with agonized attention to detail, families bankrupting themselves to pay for medical treatments that everyone knew wouldn't work. Other evidence suggests calculated distance, parents who sent sick children to hospitals knowing they would never see them again, fathers who refused to interrupt business travel even when telegraphed that a child was dying. A quirky and heartbreaking detail. Victorian memorial photography documented dead children with careful attention to pose and setting. These post-mortem photographs, which seem macabre to modern eyes, were often the only images a family possessed of a child who had lived too briefly to be photographed alive. The dead child would be dressed in their best clothes, arranged to appear sleeping, sometimes posed with surviving siblings who sat stiffly beside their deceased brother or sister. These photographs were treasured, displayed, passed down through generations, evidence that the child had existed, had been loved, had mattered despite the brevity of their time. The nursery around you feels different now, knowing what you know. Every object in this room, the crib, the toys, the improving books, exists under the shadow of probable loss. The infant sleeping in the crib might live to adulthood, or might be buried in the churchyard before spring. The older children at their lessons might grow up to have children of their own, or might succumb to the next outbreak of scarlet fever. The nursemaid herself might catch something contagious from her charges and die before them. Death was woven into the fabric of Victorian childhood so completely that it shaped everything. The emotional distance, the religious intensity, the hurry to instill moral lessons before time ran out. You think about modern parents, with their car seats and baby monitors and elaborate safety precautions, their expectation that children who are born will live to adulthood, barring unusual tragedy. That expectation is historically unprecedented. For most of human history, and certainly throughout the Victorian period, parents raised children knowing that death could come at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all. The Victorian approach to childhood, harsh as it was, developed in response to this reality. Perhaps distance and discipline were the only ways to survive the endless parade of small coffins. You move from the nursery to the bookshelf that stands against one wall, where the improving literature you noticed earlier awaits closer examination. These books, with their drab covers and their stern titles, represent yet another weapon in the Victorian arsenal of child-rearing, the strategic use of fear. If physical punishment disciplined the body, and dietary restriction disciplined the appetite, then children's literature disciplined the imagination, filling young minds with visions of terrible consequences for even minor misdeeds. You pull a volume from the shelf and recognise it immediately. The History of the Fairchild Family by Mary Martha Sherwood, first published in 1818 and reprinted throughout the Victorian era. This book was standard nursery reading, considered wholesome and appropriate entertainment for children as young as 4 or 5. What it actually contains would be classified as horror fiction by modern standards. The Fairchild family follows the children of a pious household as they encounter various moral challenges and learn appropriate lessons, often through witnessing or experiencing terrible suffering. In one famous passage, the father takes his children to see a rotting corpse hanging from a gibbet, the decomposing body of a man executed for murdering his brother. The father uses this spectacle to deliver a lecture on the dangers of sibling rivalry, warning his children that their petty quarrels could lead to similar outcomes. The children, traumatized but presumably improved, return home to be better behaved. This wasn't unusual. Victorian children's literature was saturated with death, punishment, and divine retribution. The German author Heinrich Hoffmann created Struwwelpeter, a collection of illustrated cautionary tales that became enormously popular in English translation. Its stories featured children who sucked their thumbs, having them cut off by a tailor with giant scissors, a boy who refused to eat his soup, wasting away and dying within a week, a girl playing with matches burning to death while her cats weep, a boy who went out in a storm being blown away, never to return. The illustrations were vivid, almost cartoonish in their grotesquerie, designed to imprint these lessons on young minds through sheer memorability. The purpose of such literature was explicitly didactic. Entertainment for its own sake was suspect. Pleasure without instruction led to moral weakness. Stories had to teach lessons, and the most effective lessons involved consequences so dire that no child could forget them. A girl who was vain might end up disfigured. A boy who stole might lose his hand. A child who disobeyed parents might die suddenly, their soul departing before repentance was possible. The message was clear. The world is dangerous, sin leads to suffering, and only perfect obedience offers any safety. Here's where modern child psychology would raise serious objections. We now understand that exposing young children to graphic depictions of violence and death can be traumatizing rather than instructive. Fear-based discipline tends to produce anxious, secretive children rather than genuinely moral ones. Children who avoid misbehaviour not because they understand why it's wrong, but because they're terrified of punishment. The Victorian approach, which assumed that children needed to be frightened into goodness, may have created generations of adults who struggled with anxiety, who learned to hide their true selves, who associated authority with terror. Historians still argue about whether Victorian children actually experienced these books as traumatic, or whether they processed them differently, perhaps with more resilience or more psychological distance than we might expect. Some scholars point out that death and violence were more visible in Victorian daily life. Children saw animals slaughtered, witnessed public executions, attended deathbeds of relatives, and may have been less shocked by literary depictions than modern children would be. Others suggest that the trauma was real but unacknowledged, manifesting in symptoms that the Victorians attributed to other causes. A quirky detail. Some Victorian children's books included deliberately incorrect information that children were expected to identify and correct, as a test of their knowledge. Others contained hidden messages in first letters of sentences, spelling out moral maxims for attentive readers to discover. The books were pedagogical instruments first and stories second, their narrative elements subordinated to their educational functions. Entertainment value was beside the point, indeed, was somewhat suspicious, since too entertaining books might capture children's attention for the wrong reasons. The nursemaid, who's been watching you examine the books, mentions that she reads to the children every evening before bed. Tonight's selection, she says, will be a chapter about a boy who disobeys his mother and is subsequently killed by a runaway horse. The children know this story well. It's a favourite in the sense that familiarity has made it comfortable rather than frightening. They listen with solemn attention, perhaps imagining themselves in the boy's place, perhaps simply enduring the ritual as they endure so much else. You put the book back on the shelf and think about what these stories did to young imaginations. Children who grew up on a diet of cautionary tales learned to see danger everywhere, to anticipate punishment for every transgression, to understand the world as a place where mistakes were fatal and authority was absolute. Some of them rebelled against this worldview as adults, embracing pleasure and questioning authority with the fervour of escaped prisoners. Others internalized it completely, becoming the rigid, anxious, punitive parents who would raise the next generation in the same traditions. The cycle perpetuated itself through these books as much as through any other mechanism. A mother who had grown up reading about children burned alive for playing with matches would read those same stories to her own children, finding them appropriate and improving. A father who remembered trembling at the image of the great long red-legged scissor man would show those illustrations to his sons, confident that fear was an effective teacher. Each generation passed its terrors to the next, literature serving as a vehicle for transmitting not just moral lessons, but the fear-based approach to morality itself. The cautionary tales you've been examining serve secular morality. Don't play with matches, don't disobey your mother, don't suck your thumb, but they exist within a broader religious framework that gave Victorian childhood its particular intensity. You need to understand the theology that informed every aspect of nursery life, from the prayers said at rising to the examinations of conscience conducted at bedtime. Victorian Christianity, especially in its evangelical forms, took the spiritual state of children with deadly seriousness, and the methods it employed to secure their salvation would today be recognised as psychological abuse. The doctrine of original sin lies at the heart of the matter. Every child, evangelical theology insisted, was born already corrupted, carrying the stain of Adam's disobedience as an inheritance that no amount of good behaviour could erase. This wasn't metaphorical. Victorian Christians believed that unbaptized infants who died might face eternal consequences, not necessarily the full torments of hell, which most theologians reserved for conscious sinners, but certainly exclusion from heaven's joys. Even baptized children remained fundamentally sinful, their apparent innocence a deceptive surface concealing depths of wickedness that parents must work tirelessly to address. You find yourself in the household chapel, a small room off the main corridor, furnished with a few chairs and a lectern, where daily prayers are conducted each morning. The children attend these prayers from an early age, expected to kneel on hard floors, recite responses they barely understand, and listen to readings that emphasize human depravity and divine judgment. The youngest child, barely 4, sometimes falls asleep during these services. When caught, she is pinched awake and required to remain kneeling as punishment. Sleep during prayers suggests insufficient spiritual seriousness. The religious instruction extends far beyond daily services. Children memorize catechisms, structured sequences of questions and answers covering the fundamentals of Christian doctrine. They commit biblical passages to memory, reciting them under the watchful eye of the governess or a visiting clergyman. They are required to give accounts of their spiritual state, to confess their sins and shortcomings, to examine their consciences for evidence of the wickedness they've been taught to expect. A child who reports feeling happy might be questioned about whether this happiness comes from God or from worldly pleasures that distract from spiritual concerns. The fear of damnation was cultivated deliberately. Sermons and readings emphasized the torments awaiting sinners, eternal fire, unquenchable thirst, the gnashing of teeth, the worm that never dies. Children were told that hell was not only real but populated, that countless souls, including perhaps people they had known, were suffering there right now and would suffer forever. The purpose was not cruelty, but motivation. If children truly understood what awaited the unrepentant, surely they would do whatever was necessary to secure their salvation. Here's what makes this particularly intense. Victorian evangelicalism emphasized conversion experiences, moments of spiritual awakening when the individual truly accepted Christ and was born again. But when could a child have such an experience? At what age was conversion possible? Some theologians argued that children could be saved from infancy through parental faith and proper training. Others insisted that each individual must have their own moment of decision, which required a level of cognitive development that young children hadn't achieved. Parents caught between these positions might spend years anxiously watching their children for signs of genuine conversion, terrified that death might come before salvation was secured. The emphasis on breaking the child's will gains new meaning in this religious context. The will was the seat of sin, the faculty through which humans chose evil over good. A child's will, unbroken, would naturally choose sin, selfishness, pleasure, disobedience, and lead inexorably to damnation. Breaking the will wasn't cruelty but rescue, saving the child from their own fallen nature. The parent who beat their child into submission was fighting for that child's eternal soul, battling against forces of wickedness that the child couldn't even understand. Historians still argue about whether Victorian religious instruction was genuinely traumatizing, or whether children adapted to it as they adapted to everything else in their environment. Some evidence suggests that many Victorian children experienced intense religious anxiety, lying awake at night terrified of hell, convinced that their smallest sins had damned them forever. Other evidence suggests that the religious framework, however harsh, provided meaning and structure that children found comforting, answering questions about life and death that might otherwise have been unbearable. A quirky detail that illuminates the intensity of Victorian religious instruction. Some evangelical households conducted death rehearsals with their children, having them lie in bed imagining that they were dying, confessing their sins, and preparing their souls for judgment. These exercises were considered spiritually beneficial, helping children take death seriously while they still had time to repent. The psychological effects on a 6-year-old repeatedly told to imagine dying and facing God's judgment were not considered relevant to the calculation. The children you've been observing in this household undergo all of these practices. The daily prayers, the catechism drills, the biblical memorization, the examinations of conscience. They've been taught to distrust their own impulses, to assume that their natural desires are sinful, to fear both God and their own hearts. They perform their religious duties with the same careful obedience they bring to everything else, their faces betraying nothing of whatever spiritual anxieties they might harbour. Tonight, when the nursemaid reads them their cautionary tale about the disobedient boy killed by a horse, the religious framework will provide the context. The boy didn't just die, he died in his sins, possibly damned forever, his brief earthly existence followed by eternal torment. The message isn't merely that disobedience leads to death, but that death leads to judgment, and judgment might go very badly indeed. Sleep tight, children. God is watching. You've been observing a household with both male and female children, and you've noticed differences in how they're treated, different clothes, different toys, different expectations, but you haven't yet examined systematically how Victorian childhood varied by gender. The cruelties weren't equally distributed. Boys and girls faced distinct forms of mistreatment, each designed to prepare them for the dramatically different adult roles that Victorian society prescribed. The girl you've been watching, the 7-year-old with her wooden doll, is being raised to become a wife and mother, which means she's being trained in submission, domesticity, and the suppression of any qualities that might make her unsuitable for those roles. Her education is lighter than her brother's, focused more on accomplishments, a little French, a little piano, some drawing, than on rigorous academics. Her mind, Victorian wisdom holds, is not designed for heavy intellectual labour. To fill it with too much learning would unbalance her constitution, possibly rendering her incapable of bearing children. Girls learned needlework from an early age, their small fingers set to embroidery and mending that would occupy them throughout their adult lives. They learned household management by watching and eventually assisting the housekeeper. They learned to arrange flowers, receive callers, make small talk, and maintain the pleasant domestic atmosphere that would make their future husbands comfortable. All of this sounds relatively benign until you recognise its implications. Girls were being trained for a life of economic dependency, domestic confinement, and social invisibility. The physical constraints were literal as well as metaphorical. As girls approached adolescence, they were put into corsets that reshaped their bodies according to fashionable ideals. Small waists, upright posture, restricted breathing. Some corsets were introduced as early as the age 6 or 7, training the body gradually toward the extreme constriction that adult fashion demanded. The health effects were considerable. Displaced organs, weakened muscles, breathing difficulties, and the various ailments grouped under the term female hysteria that may have been symptoms of chronic oxygen deprivation. Here's a practice that seems almost unbelievable. Some Victorian parents, concerned that their daughters' ears protruded too much, had them pinned surgically or bound flat against the head for years at a time. The ears had to be aesthetically pleasing for the daughter to be marriageable. Physical appearance was not a matter of personal preference, but of family economic strategy, since an unattractive daughter might fail to secure a husband and become a financial burden. Parents modified their daughters' bodies with the same instrumental logic they applied to other household investments. Boys faced different pressures, designed to produce the hardy, stoic men who would run businesses, govern colonies, and fight wars. The toughening process began early. Boys were expected to endure cold, hunger, and physical punishment without complaint. Crying was discouraged, then forbidden, then punished. A boy who showed fear or weakness was shamed by parents and peers alike, taught that emotional expression was feminine and therefore contemptible. Boys' education was more rigorous academically but also more brutal physically. They were sent to school younger, exposed to older boys who bullied them as a matter of course, subjected to canings and floggings that exceeded anything administered at home. The theory was that this treatment built character, that suffering made men. The practice was that many boys emerged from their educations traumatized, hardened, or both, carrying emotional wounds that they would inflict on the next generation. Historians still argue about whether Victorian gender differentiation in childhood was more or less harmful for boys than for girls, or whether comparison is even meaningful. Some point out that girls were at least permitted emotional expression, allowed to cry and to admit fear, while boys were systematically trained to suppress their inner lives. Others note that girls were denied education, autonomy, and any realistic path to independence, their fates determined entirely by their ability to attract husbands. A quirky detail that reveals the anxiety surrounding gender in Victorian childhood. Some parents whose children showed cross-gender behaviour, girls who wanted to climb trees, boys who cried easily, sought medical treatment for these conditions. Physicians might prescribe tonics, cold baths, or physical punishments designed to restore proper gender performance. The categories of male and female were considered natural and fixed, and any deviation indicated disorder requiring correction. The children you've been observing seem, at least superficially, to have accepted their gendered roles. The girl plays with her doll, practicing maternal care. The boy arranges his soldiers, rehearsing military command. But what happens in their private thoughts, in the moments before sleep when no one is watching? Do they feel the constraints pressing against them? Do they imagine other lives, other possibilities, other selves? You'll never know. The historical record preserves behaviour but not inner experience. What we can say is that Victorian childhood shaped boys and girls for different forms of limitation, different kinds of suffering, different varieties of the fundamental Victorian conviction that children's natural impulses must be suppressed for their own good. The girl will grow into a woman constrained by marriage and domesticity. The boy will grow into a man constrained by expectations of stoicism and dominance. Both will carry the scars of their training into adult lives that will seem, from the inside, entirely normal. The comfortable suburban house you've been exploring represents one version of Victorian childhood, the experience of the middle class, with its nurseries and governesses and improving literature. But for boys of the upper classes, childhood often involved a more radical displacement, being sent away from home entirely at ages as young as 7 or 8, to boarding schools where they would remain for months at a time, shaped by institutions rather than families. You find yourself standing outside the gates of a fictional but representative establishment, let's call it Blackwood Academy, where the carriage deposits boys who will not see their families until Christmas holidays, if then. The building looms in grey stone, its windows small and high, its grounds surrounded by walls designed to keep boys in rather than intruders out. This is where the ruling class of the British Empire is manufactured, through a process that combines academic instruction with systematic brutality. The dormitories are your first shock. Boys sleep in unheated rooms, sometimes 30 or 40 to a space, on narrow beds with thin blankets. The windows are left open year-round on the theory that cold air builds character. Younger boys often wake to find their water basins frozen solid, requiring them to break the ice before they can wash. Chilblains, painful swellings caused by cold exposure, are endemic. Respiratory infections sweep through the dormitories regularly, killing some boys and weakening others. The food situation mirrors what you saw in the nursery, but worse. Boarding school meals are deliberately inadequate, providing less nutrition than growing boys require. The theory is that hunger teaches discipline. The practice is that boys are perpetually underfed, supplementing their official rations with food parcels from home or purchases from local shops when they can manage it. Malnutrition stunts growth and weakens immune systems, contributing to the high rate of illness and death at these institutions. The official punishments administered by masters are severe: caning on the hands or buttocks for academic failures, longer beatings for behavioural infractions, but they pale beside the unofficial violence inflicted by older boys on younger ones. The fagging system, which existed at many elite schools, required younger boys to serve as personal servants to older ones, making their beds, polishing their boots, running their errands. Failure to satisfy the older boys' demands resulted in beatings that masters either ignored or tacitly approved. New boys, called fags, existed in a state of near-constant terror, subject to demands and punishments at all hours. Here's where the situation becomes most disturbing. Sexual abuse was endemic at many Victorian boarding schools, though it was rarely discussed openly and almost never prosecuted. Older boys assaulted younger ones in the dormitories, in the lavatories, in any space where supervision was absent. Masters sometimes participated in or facilitated this abuse. The institution's response, when any response occurred, was typically to punish the victims for allowing themselves to be abused or to expel boys whose complaints threatened the school's reputation. Historians still argue about the extent of sexual abuse in Victorian boarding schools and about whether it was recognised as abuse at the time or normalised as an expected part of the experience. Some old boys wrote memoirs decades later describing their experiences in terms that modern readers immediately recognise as assault. Others seem genuinely to have processed their experiences as normal, even positive elements of their education. The schools themselves maintained silence, their records carefully purged of any evidence that might suggest impropriety. A quirky detail that reveals the strange moral priorities of the boarding school system: academic cheating was punished far more severely than physical or sexual assault. A boy caught copying homework might be publicly beaten and expelled in disgrace. A boy who brutalised younger students would, at worst, be told to moderate his behaviour. The hierarchy of offences reflected the hierarchy of values. Intellectual integrity mattered. Physical and emotional safety did not. The boys who survived this system, and survival is not too strong a word, emerged transformed in ways that shaped the course of history. They learned to suppress emotion, to endure pain without complaint, to dominate those below them and submit to those above. They formed intense bonds with fellow survivors, bonds that would later be activated in business, politics, and empire. They developed the stiff upper lip, that characteristic British inability to acknowledge suffering, that served them well in the trenches and boardrooms where they would spend their adult lives. Some scholars argue that the boarding school system was deliberately designed to produce a certain type of person: the imperial administrator, the military officer, the captain of industry. These roles required men who could inflict suffering without flinching, who could order colonial subjects flogged or soldiers shot, who could make decisions affecting thousands of lives while remaining emotionally detached. The schools manufactured this capacity through early and intensive training, in both receiving and administering violence. You leave Blackwood Academy's gates and think about the small boys arriving each autumn, their trunks packed by mothers who might never have experienced anything like what their sons were about to endure. Did those mothers know? Did those fathers remember their own school days and send their sons deliberately, believing it necessary? Did anyone question the system that processed generation after generation of young boys through this machinery of suffering? Some did. By the late Victorian period, reformers were beginning to challenge the worst excesses of the boarding school system. Heating was introduced in some dormitories, food improved marginally, masters were occasionally held accountable for excessive brutality. But the fundamental culture, the cold, the hunger, the fagging, the beatings, persisted well into the 20th century and beyond. The schools that educated Winston Churchill and George Orwell would have been recognisable to boys who attended decades earlier. You turn now from the privileged brutality of the boarding school to a different kind of institutional childhood, the workhouse. If boarding schools were designed to shape the ruling class through suffering, workhouses were designed to punish the poor for their poverty, while extracting whatever labour could be squeezed from their bodies. The children who grew up in these institutions experienced deprivation that makes the middle-class nursery look like paradise. The workhouse system was established by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which centralised relief for the destitute while deliberately making that relief as unappealing as possible. The principle was less eligibility. Conditions in the workhouse had to be worse than the worst conditions available to independent workers, so that no one would enter voluntarily except in absolute desperation. This principle was applied with particular rigour to children, who represented the majority of workhouse inmates during much of the Victorian period. You enter through the gates of a typical workhouse, noting immediately the division of the facility into separate wings, men's, women's, and children's. Families who entered together were immediately separated. Husbands were taken from wives, parents from children, siblings from siblings. This separation was deliberate, intended to discourage families from seeking relief unless they had no other option. The cruelty was the point. Or rather, the cruelty was considered necessary to prevent abuse of the system by people who might otherwise choose workhouse dependency over honest labour. The children's ward is a bleak space. Rows of beds or hammocks, whitewashed walls, bare floors, and windows set too high for anyone to see out. The children here range in age from infants to adolescents, some born in the workhouse, others brought in when their parents died or became unable to care for them. They wear identical uniforms of coarse fabric, their hair cut short for ease of maintenance, their bodies marked by malnutrition and neglect. The diet in the workhouse is the famous gruel, a thin porridge of oatmeal and water, sometimes supplemented with small amounts of bread, cheese, or meat on designated days. The portions are calculated to sustain life without promoting comfort. Children are constantly hungry, their growth stunted, their immune systems compromised. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, is endemic. Scurvy appears among children whose diets lack fresh fruits and vegetables for months at a time. Here's where the workhouse system reveals its particular horror. Children were expected to earn their keep through labour. From ages as young as 5 or 6, they were put to work at tasks designed to instill discipline and offset the cost of their maintenance. Younger children picked oakum, separating old rope fibres for reuse, a task that shredded their small fingers. Older children worked in workhouse kitchens, laundries or workshops. Some were hired out to local factories or farms, their labour sold to employers who found workhouse children conveniently cheap and easily controlled. The education provided in workhouses was minimal, intended to produce compliant workers rather than independent thinkers. Children learned basic literacy and arithmetic, enough to follow instructions and keep simple accounts. Girls learned domestic skills that would qualify them for service. Boys learned manual trades that would make them employable. The goal was not to improve their circumstances, but to ensure that they would leave the workhouse capable of the lowest forms of labour and unlikely to return. Historians still argue about whether workhouse conditions were deliberately cruel or simply reflected the general harshness of Victorian life. Some point to the regulations themselves, which specified minimum standards for food, clothing and accommodation that, if followed, would have provided at least basic sustenance. Others note that individual workhouses frequently violated these regulations, that inspectors were infrequent and easily deceived, and that the culture of less eligibility encouraged officials to err on the side of deprivation. A quirky and heartbreaking detail. Children in workhouses were sometimes given numbers instead of names, their identities reduced to administrative categories. The name they had arrived with, the name their parents had chosen, the name that connected them to family and history, was replaced by a number stitched into their uniform, used in all official records, spoken by staff who couldn't be bothered to remember individual children. Some workhouse children forgot their original names entirely, growing into adults who knew themselves only by numbers that no longer had any official meaning. The path out of the workhouse was often worse than the path in. Children who reached working age were apprenticed out to employers who had agreed to take them, sometimes paying a small premium for the privilege. These employers were not screened for suitability. Some were honest tradespeople who treated their apprentices reasonably. Others were abusers who saw workhouse children as cheap labour to be exploited without consequence. Horror stories emerged periodically of apprenticed children worked to death, beaten to death, or simply disappeared. Their fates of no interest to the authorities who had transferred responsibility. You leave the workhouse through the same gates you entered, passing children who watch your departure with expressions that might be curiosity, might be envy, might be nothing at all. They'll sleep tonight in their narrow beds, wake tomorrow to oakum picking or laundry work, eat their gruel and attend their minimal lessons and count the years until they're old enough to be sent elsewhere. Some will survive this childhood and build lives of modest success. Others will carry its marks forever, passing through a world that barely acknowledges their existence. You step outside the workhouse gates and back into the streets of Victorian London, where you immediately encounter yet another category of suffering childhood. The street children, those thousands upon thousands of boys and girls who lived entirely outside any institutional structure, surviving on their wits, their labour, and their willingness to break laws that offered them no protection. Estimates vary, but scholars believe that at any given time during the Victorian period, somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 children lived on the streets of London alone. Some were orphans with no family at all. Some had families who could not or would not support them. Some had run away from situations, domestic abuse, institutional brutality, apprenticeships that were slavery in all but name, that seemed worse than the streets. They lived in doorways, under bridges, in abandoned buildings, in any shelter they could find or create. They called themselves, with grim humour, street Arabs, or gutter snipes. You watch a group of them now, gathered around a small fire in an alley, their faces blackened with soot, their clothes a patchwork of rags. The oldest might be 14, the youngest perhaps 6. They're sharing a loaf of bread stolen from somewhere, dividing it with rough justice among themselves. This is their family, their social unit, the gang, the group of children who have found each other and formed bonds of mutual survival in a world that offers them nothing else. Street children worked when they could. The boys sold matches, newspapers or flowers. They held horses while their owners went about their business. They swept crossings, clearing paths through horse dung for pedestrians who might toss them a penny. The girls did similar work, or they begged, or they drifted into prostitution at ages that make the term itself obscene. The work rarely paid enough to survive on, which meant that most street children also stole, picking pockets, lifting goods from market stalls, breaking into buildings when opportunities arose. The legal system treated these children as criminals rather than victims. A boy caught stealing a handkerchief might be sentenced to transportation, exile to Australia or another colony, never to return. A girl caught soliciting might be sent to a reformatory where the conditions differed little from prison. The age of criminal responsibility was 7 years old until 1847, when it was raised to 14 for minor offences, though children could still be prosecuted for serious crimes at any age. Children were held in the same prisons as adults, exposed to hardened criminals who might corrupt or abuse them, emerging more damaged than when they entered. Here's where the desperation of street life becomes most visible. Some children mutilated themselves to become more effective beggars. They deliberately created injuries that would evoke pity, blinding themselves, breaking limbs, cultivating sores that looked worse than they were. Other children were mutilated by adults who controlled them. Professional beggars who understood that a child with a visibly maimed arm collected more coins than an intact one. The market for pity was competitive, and street children adapted to its demands. The dangers beyond poverty and crime were manifold. Street children died of exposure during cold winters, their bodies collected from doorways where they had curled up seeking warmth. They died of diseases that spread easily in their crowded, unsanitary living conditions. They died from violence, both from adults who preyed on them and from other children competing for territory or resources. The mortality rate among street children was appalling but rarely documented since no one was counting. Historians still argue about whether street children should be understood as victims of circumstance or as agents navigating impossible conditions with remarkable resourcefulness. Some emphasise the suffering, the cold, the hunger, the violence, the exploitation by adults who should have protected them. Others emphasise the survival, the social structures street children created, the economies they invented, the resilience they demonstrated in circumstances that would break most adults. A quirky detail that reveals both the desperation and the ingenuity of street children. Some organised themselves into elaborate criminal networks with hierarchies, training systems, and profit-sharing arrangements. The pickpocket gangs described by Charles Dickens in Oliver Twist were not entirely fictional. An experienced adult criminal, a kidsman, might recruit and train young pickpockets, providing them with food and shelter in exchange for their earnings. From one perspective, this was child exploitation of the worst kind. From another, it was the only economic system that offered street children any path to survival. You watch the children finish their bread and scatter into the darkening streets, each going about whatever business the evening will bring. One of them will be caught stealing tonight and sentenced to transportation, never to see England again. Another will die of consumption within the year, their body buried in a pauper's grave. A third will somehow survive childhood, enter domestic service, and live to old age, carrying memories of these streets that they'll never share with anyone. The gas lamps are being lit along the main roads, casting pools of yellow light that the street children avoid. They exist in the shadows, in the spaces between the legitimate city, in a world that Victorian society preferred not to see. And yet they were everywhere. Impossible to ignore entirely, impossible to address effectively, impossible to incorporate into a social order that had no place for children without families, without homes, without futures. You've seen children exploited in factories and mines, beaten in nurseries and boarding schools, starved in workhouses and on streets. But there remains one more category of Victorian childhood horror to examine, one that represents perhaps the darkest corner of this dark landscape. Baby farming. The industry of paid child disposal that flourished throughout the Victorian period and killed countless infants, whose only crime was being unwanted. The term itself, baby farming, sounds almost quaint, suggesting something rural and wholesome. The reality was anything but. Baby farming referred to the practice of paying someone to take custody of an unwanted child, usually an illegitimate infant whose existence threatened the reputation of an unmarried mother. The arrangement might be presented as adoption or fosterage, with the new caretaker promising to raise the child properly in exchange for a fee. But what often happened, what everyone involved understood might happen, was that the child would simply cease to exist, eliminated through neglect or active murder. You find yourself in a dingy room in a working-class neighbourhood, where a woman who calls herself Mrs. Waters conducts her business. She's stout, middle-aged, with a manner that suggests competence and discretion. Young women come to her in desperation, servant girls made pregnant by employers, shop assistants seduced by married men, any woman whose pregnancy threatens her livelihood and reputation. Mrs. Waters offers a solution. For a fee, sometimes a one-time payment, sometimes ongoing support, she'll take the baby. No questions asked, no judgment offered, no evidence left behind. The babies come to Mrs. Waters in various states. Some newborn, some a few weeks old, some already sickly from inadequate care during their mother's difficult pregnancies. She keeps them briefly, perhaps a few days, perhaps a few weeks. Then they disappear. Some are passed to other baby farmers in a chain of custody that obscures their origins. Some are registered under false names and quietly allowed to die of natural causes. Some are simply killed outright, their bodies disposed of in rivers, in fields, in the urban waste that Victorian sanitation struggled to manage. The economics of baby farming made death profitable. A mother paying for ongoing care wanted her payments to stop as soon as possible. The baby's death freed her from an endless obligation. A baby farmer receiving a one-time payment had no incentive to keep the child alive. Every day of life was a drain on a finite resource. The structure of the transaction pushed toward elimination, and elimination happened with terrible regularity. Here's the detail that reveals how normalized this practice became. Baby farmers advertised openly in newspapers and shop windows. A good home wanted for healthy infant. Respectable woman will adopt child, moderate premium required. These advertisements were understood by everyone who read them. The good home was often a death sentence. The moderate premium was the price of making a problem disappear. Thousands of these transactions happened every year, conducted in plain sight, unregulated by any authority that cared to intervene. The few baby farming cases that reached public attention were spectacles of horror. Margaret Waters, a real person, not our fictional Mrs. Waters, was hanged in 1870 for the deaths of multiple infants in her care. Amelia Dyer, convicted in 1896, is estimated to have killed at least 400 babies over a 20-year career. These women became monsters in the public imagination, but they were also products of a system that created demand for their services and provided minimal obstacles to their operations. Historians still argue about how to understand baby farming, as individual criminal enterprise, as systematic child murder, or as an unofficial form of population control that served the interests of a society unwilling to provide other options for unwanted children. Unmarried mothers had nowhere to turn. Their families often disowned them. Employers fired them. The few institutions that accepted illegitimate children were overwhelmed and underfunded. Baby farming filled a gap, providing a solution, however terrible, to a problem that Victorian morality created and Victorian social services refused to address. A quirky detail that illuminates the cognitive dissonance surrounding baby farming. Many of the mothers who handed their infants to baby farmers convinced themselves that their children would truly be cared for. They didn't investigate the baby farmers' credentials or check on their children's welfare. They didn't want to know. The transaction required a willful blindness on both sides. The mother pretending to believe in the good home, the baby farmer pretending to provide it, both knowing the truth without ever speaking it aloud. Reform came slowly, as reform always did in Victorian England. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1872 required baby farmers to register with local authorities, but enforcement was minimal and easily evaded. The Children Act of 1889 gave authorities limited power to intervene in cases of abuse and neglect, but baby farming continued. Not until the 20th century, with the development of comprehensive child welfare systems and more effective contraception and eventually legal abortion, did the demand that fueled baby farming begin to diminish. You leave Mrs. Waters' room and step back into the street thinking about the babies who passed through such places, the ones who survived to uncertain futures, the ones who didn't survive at all. They had no monuments, no gravestones, no records of their brief existence. They were problems to be solved, inconveniences to be managed, and when they were gone, they were forgotten. Except that they weren't entirely forgotten, because their disappearance helped create the child protection systems that would eventually emerge, each new law a response to horrors that should never have been possible. The horrors you've witnessed, the baby farmers, the street children, the workhouses, the factories, did not go entirely unopposed. Throughout the Victorian period, reformers argued, agitated and occasionally achieved modest victories in the long campaign to establish the revolutionary idea that children deserved legal protection. You need to meet these reformers, to understand their motivations and methods, to appreciate how radical their proposals seemed to their contemporaries. The reform movement emerged from various sources. Evangelical Christians, the same people whose theology demanded that children's wills be broken, also believed in mercy and charity toward the suffering. They founded orphanages, ragged schools and rescue missions, attempting to save children's bodies while attending to their souls. Social reformers influenced by utilitarian philosophy calculated the cost of wasted human potential and argued that healthy, educated children would contribute more to national prosperity than stunted, ignorant ones. Romantic idealists drew on a different tradition entirely, seeing in childhood a natural innocence that industrial society was corrupting. You meet in a sense the Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, whose parliamentary career spanned much of the Victorian period, and who became perhaps the most effective advocate for children's welfare. Shaftesbury was an evangelical Christian of the most intense variety, a man who believed in hellfire and damnation, in the breaking of children's wills, in the entire theological apparatus that seems so cruel to modern sensibilities. Yet he also believed that cruelty toward children's bodies was an offence against God, that the factory system was sinful, that climbing boys and mine children were being murdered by a society that called itself Christian. Shaftesbury's achievement was to translate moral outrage into legislative action. He sponsored and shepherded through Parliament a series of acts that, while modest by modern standards, represented genuine progress. The Mines Act of 1842, prohibiting the employment of women and children underground, the Factory Acts that progressively limited working hours for children, the Chimney Sweepers Acts that eventually outlawed the use of climbing boys. Each bill faced fierce opposition from industrialists, economists who warned of competitive disadvantage, and politicians who saw any regulation as dangerous government overreach. Here's what made Shaftesbury's approach effective. He documented. He sent investigators into mines and factories, commissioning reports that included detailed testimony from child workers themselves. These reports, published with illustrations of half-naked children in underground tunnels and emaciated boys trapped in chimney flues, shocked public opinion in ways that abstract arguments never could. The image became a reform tool, and Shaftesbury wielded it masterfully. Other reformers took different approaches. Thomas Barnardo, arriving in London from Ireland in 1866, was horrified by the street children he encountered. He began taking in homeless boys, eventually founding the network of homes that would bear his name and provide shelter for hundreds of thousands of children over the following century. Barnardo's methods were controversial. He was accused of exaggerating the children's circumstances, of kidnapping children from families that wanted them, of sending children to Canada against their parents' wishes, but he undeniably saved many lives. The founding of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 1884 represented a new phase in child protection. For the first time, an organisation existed specifically to investigate reports of child abuse and neglect, to prosecute offenders, and to remove children from dangerous situations. The NSPCC began with just one inspector covering all of England. Within a few years, it had a national network. The organisation pushed for legislative changes and provided the enforcement mechanism that made new laws meaningful. Historians still argue about the motivations driving Victorian child protection reform. Some emphasise genuine humanitarianism. Reformers who saw suffering and wanted to stop it, who believed that children deserved better regardless of any practical calculation. Others point to less elevated motivations, the desire to control the working class, to impose middle-class values on the poor, to create a docile and efficient workforce. The reformers themselves probably held mixed motivations, their genuine compassion intertwined with class prejudice, their Christian charity contaminated by religious imperialism. A quirky detail that reveals the strangeness of the reform moment. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was founded 60 years before the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Horses had legal protection before children did. When reformers in New York first brought a child abuse case in the 1870s, they had to argue that the child in question was a member of the animal kingdom, and therefore entitled to the same protection as a horse. The law literally could not conceive of children as having rights separate from their parents. The reformers you've met, Shaftesbury, Barnardo, the founders of the NSPCC, were products of their time in all its contradictions. They believed things about children, about class, about race, about religion that we would find objectionable. They implemented solutions that sometimes caused new harms, separating families that might have stayed together, sending children to colonies where they faced different forms of exploitation. But they also initiated a shift in consciousness, moving society toward the recognition that children were not merely property, that parents did not have absolute rights over their offspring, that the state had some responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. The reformers you've just met laid the groundwork, but the transformation of children from property to persons happened through specific legal changes, each one fought over and compromised and incomplete. You need to trace the major milestones in this legislative evolution to understand how the framework that today seems obvious, children have rights, abuse is criminal, the state can intervene, emerged from a world that had no such framework. The Factory Acts, which we touched on earlier, established the principle that government could regulate the conditions under which children worked. This seems unremarkable now, but was genuinely revolutionary in an era dominated by laissez-faire economics. If the state could tell a factory owner how many hours a child could work, what else might it regulate? The slippery slope arguments that opponents deployed against these acts were not entirely wrong. They were simply describing a future that we now consider desirable. The Education Acts beginning in 1870 approached children's welfare from a different angle. By making education compulsory, these acts effectively limited child labour, since children who were required to be in school could not be simultaneously employed in factories or mines. The enforcement was imperfect. Many working-class families evaded the requirements, and the fine for non-attendance was often less than the wages a child could earn, but the principle was established. Children's time belonged partly to their education, not entirely to their parents' economic calculations. The Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act of 1889, sometimes called the Children's Charter, represented the most direct assertion that children had rights against their own parents. For the first time in English legal history, child abuse became a criminal offence. Parents could be prosecuted for cruelty, neglect, or exploitation. Courts could remove children from dangerous homes. The private domain of the family, previously inviolable, became subject to state oversight. Here's the key provision that transformed the legal landscape. The 1889 Act made it illegal to cause a child unnecessary suffering. This language seems obvious. Of course, unnecessary suffering should be prohibited, but its implications were revolutionary. Suffering that parents might consider necessary for discipline or character formation could now be judged by external standards. A father who believed that beating his child to the point of injury was essential to proper upbringing could now be prosecuted if a court disagreed. The subsequent Children Act of 1894 strengthened these provisions and added new ones. Parents who allowed their children to beg, who exploited them in street performances, or who kept them in unsanitary conditions could be prosecuted. The age below which a child's consent to sexual activity was legally meaningless was raised repeatedly as reformers pushed against the sexual exploitation that pervaded Victorian society. Each change expanded the zone of protection around children, while limiting the absolute authority that parents had previously enjoyed. Historians still argue about whether these legal changes drove social transformation or merely reflected transformations already underway. Did the laws create new norms, or did new norms create the political conditions for new laws? The answer is probably both, operating in a feedback loop where legal prohibition and social disapproval reinforced each other, each making the other more powerful. A quirky detail that illuminates the pace of change. As late as 1870, a father who beat his child to death might face no legal consequences if he could convince a jury that he was administering reasonable discipline. By 1900, the same act would be prosecuted as murder. 30 years had changed not only the law, but the cultural consensus about what parents could legitimately do to their children. The transformation was incomplete. Many forms of corporal punishment remained legal. Many abuses went unpunished, but the direction was clear. The legal architecture that emerged from Victorian reform efforts still shapes child protection today. The concept of the best interests of the child as a standard for decision-making, the power of courts to remove children from abusive homes, the criminalisation of child labour and exploitation, all of these trace back to legislation passed in the Victorian period. When a modern social worker investigates a report of child abuse, they're operating within a framework that Victorian reformers built, using powers that Victorian legislators granted, pursuing goals that Victorian advocates articulated. But we shouldn't idealise the Victorian reformers or their achievements. The laws they passed were full of loopholes. The institutions they created often replicated the abuses they were meant to prevent. The children they rescued sometimes ended up in situations no better than the ones they left. Reform was always partial, always contested, always shaped by the prejudices and blind spots of its proponents. The work that began in the Victorian period has continued ever since, each generation identifying new harms and constructing new protections, building on foundations that remain fundamentally Victorian. You've been observing Victorian childhood primarily through the lens of the comfortable middle class and the desperately poor, but these categories don't exhaust the variety of experience. Before we begin to wind down this journey, you should understand that suffering crossed class lines, taking different forms at different social levels, but remaining remarkably consistent in its core features. The children of the aristocracy, the children of the middle class, and the children of the poor all faced versions of the same fundamental challenge. A society that saw them as incomplete humans requiring completion through discipline, deprivation, and pain. The aristocratic nursery, you might imagine, would be a place of luxury and indulgence. After all, wealthy families could afford the best of everything: the finest nursemaids, the most expensive toys, the most nutritious food. But the reality was often the opposite. Aristocratic parents took the philosophy of strategic deprivation to its logical extreme, believing that children who inherited wealth and privilege needed especially rigorous training to avoid being destroyed by their good fortune. The children of dukes and earls often saw their parents even less frequently than their middle-class counterparts. They were raised in separate wings of vast country houses, cared for by servants who answered to housekeepers and stewards rather than to the children's mothers. Visits to parents were formal occasions, requiring special dress and careful rehearsal of proper behaviour. Emotional expression was even more suspect in the aristocracy than elsewhere, seen as vulgar, middle class, unsuitable for families whose status required the performance of effortless superiority. Here's a detail that captures the peculiar isolation of aristocratic childhood. Some children in great houses went years without physical affection from any family member. Their nursemaids might hold them, if discipline permitted, but parents maintained physical as well as emotional distance. A child might not be touched by their mother between infancy and the age at which they were old enough to be formally embraced, not hugged, but greeted with the prescribed gestures that etiquette demanded. The working class, at the other extreme, faced material deprivation that made middle-class nursery restrictions seem trivial. A factory child's restricted diet wasn't a philosophical choice, but simple poverty. There wasn't enough food. A street child's emotional neglect wasn't deliberate policy. but the consequence of parents struggling to survive who had no energy left for nurturing. The working-class child experienced many of the same harms as the privileged child: beating, emotional distance, early labour, but without the compensations of education, medical care, or eventual inheritance. What linked all these experiences across class lines was the underlying philosophy. Children were problems to be solved, wills to be broken, impulses to be suppressed. Whether the instrument was a silver-handled cane in an aristocratic library or a leather strap in a factory overseer's office, the theory was the same. Children needed discipline, and discipline meant pain. Children had desires, and desires had to be thwarted. Children might develop into good adults, but only if their natural tendencies were systematically crushed. Historians still argue about whether this philosophy was uniquely Victorian, or merely a particularly well-documented example of attitudes that prevailed in most societies throughout most of history. Some point to earlier periods when children were treated with greater affection, or to other cultures where childhood was understood differently. Others argue that harsh discipline and strategic deprivation have been constants across time and space, varying only in their specific implementations. A quirky detail that captures the universality of childhood suffering across classes. Both the Duke of Marlborough's grandson and the crossing sweeper's son learned not to cry. The aristocrat was slapped by a nursemaid who'd been instructed to maintain discipline. The street child was cuffed by an older boy who had no patience for weakness. Different circumstances, same lesson. Your feelings don't matter. Your pain is irrelevant. Suppress everything that might mark you as vulnerable. The children who emerged from these varied crucibles carried their experiences into adult lives that would be shaped, in ways they couldn't understand, by what had happened in nurseries and workshops and dormitories. The empire builder who administered floggings without flinching had learned to dissociate from suffering in his own childhood. The factory owner who worked children to death had been worked himself, had survived, and saw his practices as normal. The reformer who fought against child labour might be motivated by remembered pain, or by determination that others shouldn't suffer as they had suffered. Victorian childhood was not uniformly terrible. Amid the beatings and deprivation and fear, there were also moments of joy, experiences of kindness, relationships that provided genuine warmth despite the prevailing coldness. The historical record captures the systemic cruelties but often misses the small pleasures. A nursemaid who snuck extra food, a father who occasionally played games, a sibling who offered comfort in the night nursery. Children are resilient, and Victorian children found ways to thrive, or at least survive, despite circumstances that should have broken them. The journey you've taken through Victorian childhood has been grim, a catalogue of cruelties that would be criminal today. But the story isn't purely historical. The laws and institutions and attitudes that eventually replaced Victorian practices didn't appear from nowhere. They emerged directly from Victorian experience, each reform a response to specific documented harms, each protection a reversal of specific permitted abuses. Modern child protection law is, in a very real sense, a negative image of Victorian childhood. Consider the prohibition on child labour. Modern labour laws don't merely prevent children from working in mines and factories. They're built on the assumption that childhood should be a protected period devoted to education and development rather than economic production. This assumption wasn't obvious in the Victorian period. It had to be argued for, legislated into existence, enforced against resistance. Every hour that a modern child spends in school rather than in a workshop represents a victory won in Victorian reform battles. Consider mandatory reporting laws. In most jurisdictions today, teachers, doctors and other professionals are legally required to report suspected child abuse. These laws exist because Victorian authorities had no such obligations. Abuse happened in private, behind closed doors, and no one was required to notice or intervene. The modern reporting system assumes that children's welfare is a public concern, not merely a family matter. This assumption was revolutionary when Victorian reformers first articulated it. Consider the best interests of the child standard that guides custody decisions and child welfare interventions. This phrase, which appears throughout modern family law, reverses the Victorian understanding that parents had near absolute rights over their children. When a modern court asks what arrangement best serves a child's interests, it's applying a principle that Victorian parents would have found incomprehensible. The child's interests, but the child is property, to be disposed of according to the owner's wishes. Here's where the Victorian legacy becomes most visible, the specific prohibitions that fill modern child protection codes. Prohibition against excessive corporal punishment, because Victorian parents beat their children with canes and birches and riding crops. Prohibition against child marriage, because Victorian parents sold their daughters to older men. Prohibition against educational neglect, because Victorian parents kept their children ignorant. Prohibition against medical neglect, because Victorian parents dosed their children with mercury and laudanum. Each prohibition tells a story, points to a harm that was once permitted and is now forbidden. The institutions of child protection also bear Victorian fingerprints. Social services agencies trace their lineage to the NSPCC and similar Victorian organisations. Foster care systems evolved from Victorian practices of placing children with families, some of which worked well, others disastrously. The juvenile justice system emerged from Victorian debates about whether children who committed crimes should be treated differently from adults. Even the concept of child development as a field of study has Victorian roots, growing from Victorian attempts to understand what children needed to thrive. Historians still argue about how much credit Victorian reformers deserve for modern child protection, and how much blame they deserve for modern child protection's persistent failures. The reformers established principles that we still rely on, but they also established institutional patterns that continue to harm children. The foster care system that too often replicates abuse, the juvenile justice system that criminalises poverty, the class biases that mean poor children are surveilled while wealthy children's abuse goes unnoticed. A quirky detail that captures the connection between Victorian reform and modern practice. The phrase, "children should be seen and not heard," which is often cited as encapsulating Victorian attitudes toward children, was actually used ironically by Victorian reformers criticising those attitudes. The reformers wanted children to be heard, wanted their experiences to be documented, wanted their voices to shape policy. Modern child advocacy, with its emphasis on listening to children and respecting their perspectives, continues work that began in Victorian attempts to let child workers testify about their own suffering. The transformation from Victorian childhood to modern childhood took approximately a century and is still incomplete. Children today are still beaten by parents, still exploited as labourers in some parts of the world, still neglected and abused in ways that would have been familiar to Victorian reformers. The legal frameworks exist, but enforcement is imperfect. The principles are established, but application is inconsistent. The work that began in the Victorian period continues, each generation building on what the previous generation achieved, while confronting new forms of harm that the previous generation couldn't have anticipated. You've traced this work from its origins, the first tentative suggestions that children might deserve protection, the first laws limiting their exploitation, the first institutions created to rescue them from abuse. The Victorians who created these foundations were flawed people operating within a flawed culture, and their solutions were often flawed as well. But they initiated a transformation that continues to unfold, a gradual recognition that children are persons rather than property, that their welfare matters, that their suffering is our responsibility to prevent. You step back from the Victorian nursery now, your journey through that era's childhood complete. The door through which you entered, that creaking nursery door with its particular smell of carbolic soap and coal smoke, recedes into the distance as the gaslight dims and the present reasserts itself. What you've witnessed will stay with you, but the sharp edges are softening now, the horrors settling into the category of history, of things that happened once but happen no longer. The infant in the swaddling bands has been released in some sense by the generations that came after, freed from bindings both physical and philosophical, allowed to move and grow and develop according to rhythms that the Victorians couldn't understand. The wet nurse has gone home to her own children, in a world where breastfeeding is no longer shameful and maternal bonds are no longer deliberately severed. The laudanum bottles have been cleared from the medicine cabinet, replaced by interventions that heal rather than sedate, that address causes rather than symptoms. You think about the children you've encountered on this journey. The girl with her wooden doll, practicing maternal duties in a cold nursery, learning submission through every gesture and posture and carefully controlled meal. The scullery maid at her enormous sink, her small hands raw from lye soap, her future stretching endlessly toward more of the same. The climbing boy vanishing into the chimney flue, the factory child beneath the loom, the street child counting out stolen bread in an alley. They lived, most of them. They grew up, many of them. They had children of their own, some of them, and passed along whatever they could of what they had learned. The practices that shaped them, the beatings, the deprivation, the emotional distance, the relentless discipline, have faded from acceptable parenting into the category of abuse. Not entirely, not uniformly, not everywhere, but enough that a child born today into almost any developed country will experience a childhood that Victorian children couldn't have imagined. A childhood with warmth and affection. A childhood with food that satisfies and sleep that refreshes. A childhood where adults respond to crying rather than suppress it, where desires are acknowledged even when they can't be satisfied, where the fundamental assumption is nurture rather than correction. The reformers you met, Shaftesbury with his parliamentary campaigns, Barnardo with his homes, the NSPCC inspectors with their investigations, planted seeds that grew into forests. The laws they passed became frameworks for laws we have now. The principles they articulated became assumptions we no longer question. They worked within their limitations, made compromises they probably regretted, achieved less than they hoped. But the direction they established has held, and children today are the beneficiaries of their imperfect efforts. The night outside the window has grown very quiet now. The gas lamps of Victorian London have given way to electric lights that hum gently against the darkness, and somewhere in the city a child is sleeping peacefully, not drugged into silence, not bound into stillness, but simply sleeping because sleep is natural, and the day has been full, and tomorrow will be full as well. That sleeping child carries, in some genetic or cultural sense, the legacy of all those Victorian children who came before, the survivors of a system designed to break them. You're yourself, perhaps, such a legacy. The traditions that shaped your childhood, whatever they were, trace back through generations to people who lived in the era you've been exploring. The kindnesses you received, the hugs, the stories at bedtime, the response to your crying, are gifts from reformers who argued that children deserved such kindnesses. The cruelties you avoided, the cane across the knuckles, the bread and water punishments, the endless beatings for infractions you couldn't understand, are absences created by people who fought to eliminate them. Let the images you've seen settle now into the softer part of memory. The swaddled infant, the wet nurse, the laudanum bottles, the birch rods, the factories and chimneys and workhouses and streets. They existed, they happened, they matter as history. But they are history. The present is gentler, the future gentler still, and the children sleeping tonight in nurseries around the world are sleeping in a world that has learned, however imperfectly, from the mistakes of the past. Close your eyes if they aren't closed already. Feel the weight of your body pressing against whatever surface supports you. Notice the rhythm of your breathing, steady and unforced, the kind of breathing that Victorian infants bound in swaddling bands couldn't quite manage. You have moved through the past tonight, but the past cannot hold you. You return to the present, to this moment, to the particular piece of knowing that progress is possible, that cruelty is not eternal, that children can grow up loved. The Victorian nursery door closes behind you now. The gas lamps are extinguished one by one. The sounds of that era, the clatter of hooves, the hiss of gas, the rhythmic thump of looms, fade into silence. What remains is the gentle hum of the present moment, the soft weight of your own rest approaching, the knowledge that you've travelled far and can now be still. Sleep approaches like a friendly presence, familiar and welcome. The children of the past sleep too, in whatever form sleep takes for those who are no longer alive. Perhaps they rest easier, knowing that the suffering they endured taught later generations what not to do. Perhaps they simply rest, beyond caring, beyond memory, beyond everything except the peace that comes when struggle finally ends. And you, listener, can join them now in that rest, not in their suffering, that is finished, that is history, but in the peace that follows. The story is told, the journey is complete, the night holds you gently, asking nothing, offering everything. Sweet dreams wherever you are, sleep well, and wake tomorrow to a world that, despite everything, has grown kinder.